With Councilman Green, the Vice Chair of the committee, Council President Clark, Councilman Jones, and myself, Bill Greenlee. Ms. Marconi, will you please read the title of the bills and the resolution before us today?
Bill number 170680, an ordinance amending Title 20 of the Philadelphia Code entitled Officers and Employees to add a chapter establishing a system for public financing of political campaigns, all under certain terms and conditions. Bill number 170681, an ordinance amending Chapter 20-1000 of the Philadelphia Code entitled Political Contributions and Expenditures to add and make changes to provisions regarding campaign contributions, contributions to transition and inauguration committees, and campaign finance disclosures, and making technical changes all under certain terms and conditions. Bill number 170682, an ordinance providing for the submission to the qualified electors of the City of Philadelphia of the proposals set forth in a resolution approved by council proposing an amendment to the Philadelphia Home Rule Charter, providing for public matching funding for campaigns for city office, and authorizing the appropriate officers to publish notice and to make arrangements for the special election. Resolution 170696, resolution proposing an amendment to the Philadelphia Home Rule Charter regarding appropriations and expenditures for and implementation of public financing of political campaigns pursuant to a system as may be established by council by ordinance, and providing for the submission of the amendment to the electors of Philadelphia.
Thank you. Before we have our first witness, I want to recognize Councilman Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank the members of council here and those of the public here to testify regarding this package of legislation. This is a continuation of work that started back in 2006 during my tenure working with Councilwoman Marion Tasker, where we had hearings in the Finance Committee regarding this concept of public finance of elections, where we had various individuals both throughout the country testify regarding the concept of public finance of elections. We've come a long way since that time in 2006. We've had amendments to our own local legislation in reference to campaign finance and ethics laws. I want to thank the staff and Councilman Heenan for all of their work in getting us to this point, as well as my staff, and as well as the staff of Councilwoman Sanchez. This is the beginning of a conversation regarding this concept of public finance of our local elections. In addition, this package of bills provides some other opportunities to make some other changes to our campaign finance laws to continue the work that we started in 2006, and also provide greater opportunities for people to be engaged in the public process that we call elections. So this is the beginning of a conversation. I anticipate there will be much more conversations regarding this package of bills in this committee. We look forward to engaging in a dialogue between members of the public, those who are advocates, as well as members of this committee and council as a whole, as well as administration. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Ms. Marconi, you want to call the first witness, please?
Rob Dubow, Finance Director.
And while Mr. Bowe is approaching, for those of you who are waiting to testify, for those of you who have put in written testimony, that will all be in its entirety made part of the record. Some of that testimony is kind of long, so I would respectfully ask that when you come up, you don't have to read the whole testimony. Again, it will be put into the record, that you summarize your statements, and then we'll have questions and discussions. So with that, Mr. DeBow, Ms. Adams, good morning. Ms. Adams moved out of my neighborhood, but I'm going to let that go. I'm not even going to mention it. Please.
Not going to mention it again. Good morning, Councilman Green and members of the committee. I'm Rob Dubow, Finance Director. Joining me is Ann Adams, Budget Director. We're here to testify on Resolution 170696 and Bills 170680, 81, and 82. They propose amendments to the Charter and the Philadelphia Code to establish a system of public funding for political campaigns. As Councilman Green mentioned, these proposals are part of an ongoing discussion about the city's election system. Given the significant recurring investment the legislation package would mandate, it's especially important to consider the city's current financial condition. As you know, the city will face significant structural financial challenges over the course of the upcoming 5-year plan. They include low reserves, high fixed costs, and a relatively weak tax base. Additionally, we face some immediate financial burdens, including uncertainty over state and federal funding, potential slowdown in the national economy, and a looming school district deficit. In response to this combination of structural and immediate threats, we've asked departments to reduce their spending plans by 2% in the current fiscal year. We will likely face even more difficult funding decisions in next year's budget and the upcoming 5-year plan. Estimates from the Campaign Finance Institute and the Board of Ethics suggest the proposal before the committee today would require approximately $6.2 million in FY19 in order to fund primary and general election candidates in the 2020 cycle. This includes about $5.5 million for public campaign finance funding and to cover the costs associated with funding political campaigns, as well as approximately $700,000 in operating costs for the Board of Ethics. While the costs of future elections could be spread more evenly over the course of a 4-year election cycle, diversion of revenues into the proposal's special purpose fund, along with its mandatory appropriations for the public financing system, could directly reduce council and the administration's ability to make new investments. The requirement that this funding be segregated puts a particular constraint on the city's ability to make spending allocation decisions. In light of these constraints, we agree with the sponsor's decision to hold the bill, but remain open to continuing a dialogue on the issue. This concludes my testimony, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. DeBoe. Let me just drill down a little bit more on the finances, if I could.
Sure.
I guess one of the issues is one, if this was implemented, it would be mandatory recurring every year, correct?
That's correct.
So it will have a continuing effect on the budget from then on,
Yes,
in
it
a
would.
sense. You've both been around a little while. Mr. Bowe, you a lot longer because you're a lot older. But given our financial situation, would you say this is a particularly bad time for such legislation, or challenging? Let me not use the word bad. Challenging.
It is a very challenging time, and as we mentioned in the testimony, in addition to kind of the long-term structural problems that we face, there are some real significant short-term or immediate concerns that make this a really challenging time for our finances.
Okay, and I know there's already plans to have to cut certain departments because of our budget issues, the school district budget, coming up and all that kind of thing. But as far as some other departments or other issues, how would you say this could affect? Because with having this much money added to the budget, things like police, housing, could you comment on that a little bit? Or?
So I think anytime you make a funding decision, you're deciding that you're allocating money a certain way, and then you won't have it available for other things. And then it's particularly hard if there's a requirement that it be put in a segregated fund. Then it's clearly not available. And obviously in the peak years, when you're talking about $7 million, that can fund a lot.
I'm sorry, what was the last part you said?
That can fund a lot, in the peak years.
Could fund a lot,
right.
yeah. Okay, all right. Could you give some specific examples of departments that may, the kind of decisions we here in council
Right.
would have to make if
Yeah, so for example, and I'm not, obviously the decisions don't kind of become this stark, but
Yeah, right.
I'll give you examples of what $7 million could fund. So a police officer starts at what, $50,000? So for $7 million, you could get 60, 70 police officers. So that's the scale you're talking about.
So that's an example. I got you. And last question, is there, again, from your experience, looking into the future as much as we can these days, is there any reason to think financially that things will drastically change over? I mean, are some of these challenges you're talking about likely, between schools and the opioid crisis and all that kind of thing? Would that, is it likely that kind of situation would continue?
I don't think so. I don't think that for example, our internal policy is to have a fund balance of around 7%. Mm-hmm. The Government Finance Officers Association thinks it should be more like 17%. We're not close to that, and we're unlikely to get close to that anytime soon. Our pension fund issue, we're going to face pension funding issues, at least for a decade. So, the really big issues that we're facing aren't going to go away soon.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just end by saying, and I understand certainly the argument for this, but I think when we're talking about public financing, I think we have to obviously talk a lot about financing, because that's what, that's how we're going to have to do it. So with that, I appreciate that. Before I recognize Councilman Green, just wanted to put on the record, Councilman Heenan, Majority Leader, is present, as is Councilman O'Neill, a member of the committee. Councilman Green, and then Councilman Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. DeBow, I just want to follow up on your testimony, and trying to remember, you started with the street administration as budget director, correct?
I actually started with the Rendell administration as an assistant budget director.
Assistant budget director. And then you were assistant budget director for how long with the Rendell administration?
Maybe 3 years, 2 or 3 years.
And then you were budget director.
Then I was deputy budget director.
I'm sorry?
Yes, in the Rendell administration. And then became budget director right at the end of the Rendell administration.
And then you were budget director for how many years under street administration?
I think 4.
4, okay. And then finance director?
Starting in the Nutter administration.
Nutter administration, correct. And then moving forward into this administration. And so during that time period, what has been our average fund balance?
So I can't give you the average. I can tell you the highest
percentage range. I mean, not trying to keep it to a specific amount, but the average amount our fund balance has been.
We've ranged from almost 300,000 to negative 100 million, 300 million to negative 100 million.
Okay.
And generally what you'll see is we'll have little periods where fund balance will go up and kind of get into the 200s, and then we'll come right back down.
Right. So it's gone up and down during your time period, but really we have not had a fund balance at a level that we should be having.
That's correct.
Right. And that's been going back through not only this administration, but through the Nutter administration and also through the street administration. So we've always had a kind of precarious fund balance for some time.
We have, yes. And that's limited our ability to make investments over time.
Right. It's limited our ability to make some investments. But we have made some investments when we've had the desire to do so.
Right. And it always involves choices of things that we can and can't do.
Right. Choices, exactly.
Yes.
And so the school district has also been challenging for a number of years, even before the School Reform Commission, in reference to the finances of the school district.
And that's what led to the School Reform Commission.
Which led to the School Reform Commission, and I know we're going to have a conversation about the School Reform Commission going forward, but the school district has also been a challenging financial perspective in reference to the city for a number of years.
Yeah, and their challenge over the next 5 years is particularly big because it gets to about $1 billion.
And then, during your time period in those various positions, we've had time periods like we do now where we have not had a state budget. Like during the Rendell administration, it was a long period of time where the state budget, I think, was passed in January when it should have been passed the prior June, which was the end of the fiscal year. So we've had some challenging, uncertain financial times at a state level, various times through your tenure in those various positions in the city. And then you also look at the federal government. We've had, from my understanding and recollection, a continuing resolution that's been passed every year for a number of years, but actually not a real budget being passed. Would that also be correct?
Yes, I think, and one of the differences at the federal level now is Republicans in charge of the White House and both houses of Congress.
But even during when we've had Democratic administrations, I know during the Obama administration we had sequestration, which also caused uncertainty from a financial perspective for both states around the nation and also at a local level, being the city of Philadelphia.
Yes.
All right, so when you look at your testimony that you made reference to face immediate financial burdens regarding uncertainty of the state and federal funding, potential slowdown in the national economy, and looming school district deficits, we've had it over a number of years during your tenure as assistant budget director, deputy budget director, finance director. So that's nothing new.
Well,
it's about, as you said, it's about choices and making decisions on how we're going to make
decisions. Definitely about choices. I think the combination of things that we're facing now is particularly challenging. I mean, we're coming into a hard time.
Well, it's always been a hard time. If you look at various other jurisdictions that have decided to go into public financing, they've also had similar perspectives of some of the same uncertainties regarding challenges, the economy. We had a recession in 2008. We've had uncertainty in reference to federal funding. So just like the times we're facing now, we've faced these times in the past, as well as other jurisdictions have faced these times, and they've also had public financing campaigns as well.
Yeah, we've definitely...
You can't deny that, correct?
I'm sorry?
You can't deny that, correct?
No, we definitely have had challenging times before, and so have other jurisdictions.
Right, and they still, and those jurisdictions still decided based on the will of the executive and legislative branch and the people to move forward with public financing campaigns, correct?
Yeah, and I think that your key bottom line here is it's about choices, and I think we agree on that.
Okay. And you estimated the cost about $6.2 million. I've heard smaller numbers, about half of that. I mean, you can argue one way or the other, but let's be very conservative and say $6.2 million. Our annual budget is about how much?
So our annual budget is about $4 billion.
Right, and so what percentage of $4 billion is 6.2%?
So
$6.2 million.
I'm going to answer that in two ways. It's probably about.
How about just give me the number?
Well, because I want to give you
It
context.
makes
I'll
it
give
easier
you.
for the stenographer. if
I'll
just
give
say
you the
that
number, and then I'll give you some context. So of the total budget, it's obviously a very small percent, maybe like 0.1, a little more than 0.1%.
So a little more than 0.1%.
But
do we make, well, hold on, I just want to follow up on that point.
Yeah.
So when you say a little bit about 0.1%, and you talk about new investments, do you make decisions based on new investments about that small amount of dollars?
We make decisions all the time on those type of investments, and every one of them involves kind of choices about what we can and can't do. And that's because while our budget's $4 billion, our fixed costs are really high. Our fixed costs are actually probably more than half of our budget. And then what's left, kind of the biggest area, is public safety. And we don't really have a lot of discretionary discretionary money. And in the end, when we kind of finish up the budget and go through the process with council, we're usually talking about 10 million maybe in total that we're talking about in the decisions that we're making in terms of kind of investments that we add at the end of the process.
Is that about 10 million?
Yeah, so typically when you look at kind of at the end of the council process, what changes, it's usually about a $10 million number.
Yeah, but that's what changes based on a negotiation between council and administration. You're not
That's
saying
right.
that there's only about $10 million that we have discretionary decision to make with.
No, I'm just trying to say that 6 million is a big number kind of in that world where we're kind of in the end arguing over $10 million each year.
But that's $10 million based on a mutual decision between the executive branch and legislative branch. And so if the legislative branch, which is the entity that has the responsibility for passing the budget, makes a decision on how dollars should be allocated, that's somewhat different than the executive branch, unless the mayor decides to veto. That is the decision made by the legislative branch to make that decision regarding allocating the funds. And when you say $10 million is somewhat discretionary, if this body as a whole decide to make that choice, that's still less than the conservative amount that you said of $6.2 million, which is less than 0.01% of the entire city budget.
Yeah, and that's definitely a choice. It just then takes away the discretion to do other things.
Right.
I mean, I think we're saying the same thing.
Exactly. So ultimately, it's a decision and choices that need to be made by not only this body, but also the people, because I would envision this legislation, if it were to be passed at some time in the future, ultimately would provide an opportunity for citizens of the city of Philadelphia to make a decision on whether they want to engage in public financing campaigns. And then if the will of the people vote for it, it's something that we as a body, as we as an administration, we need to implement, correct?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. First, let me let the record reflect that Councilman O and Councilwoman Bass, members of the committee, are present. Councilman Jones and then Councilman Heenan.
Good morning.
Morning.
That was a rough interrogation there. You did well.
I thought it was a friendly conversation.
Yes, it was. You responded well. I much lighter, want to focus on a couple of things. We have 2 elections a year in Philadelphia, is that correct?
Yep.
Barring a special
Primary in general, yes.
Yeah. How much does an election day cost in the city of Philadelphia?
I don't know. I'd have to get back to you on that.
That's an important number. And we have, as I remember, 1,786 divisions.
You know, we can give you actually, we can give you the commissioner's budget, which probably answers that question of we can tell you what we spend a year on the commissioners, and probably half of that is each election, roughly.
All right. And we have approximately, depending on the next census about 1,786 divisions in the city of Philadelphia. Is that correct?
Sounds about right.
Sounds about right. And in order to operate one of those polling places, you need a judge, several judges of election, and you need a machine operator. And so it's about times 5 at least folk who work on the polls. Are there any ward leaders here that can answer that? Is it 5 people to run a poll?
You're correct. Most of the time, it's 5. It could be 6, depending on the list, the size of the division.
Okay, and so what's their remuneration every election day? Does anybody know that?
Sorry, just to answer your, this is Anna Adams, Budget Director. It's the City Commissioner's budget, which is, they run elections, are somewhere between 10 and 11 million, depending on the year, depending on whether there's a big national election. So I'd say that's the amount that and that's not including their benefits, but that's just the direct amount that we spend for the City Commissioner's budget.
So it takes 5 people per polling place to operate a fair election, and that's the fundamental reason why we have commissioners. That's the fundamental reason why in the charter, to assure that that process of democracy is carried out, correct?
Correct.
So you can just go with me. Of those 5 people at times 1,700, they receive a remuneration of what per election day? Do I have a ward leader in the room?
It varies depending on whether they go to classes or not, but it's somewhere between $90 and $110
All right, so let's split
per
the baby.
person, somewhere in there.
$100.
We're going to say 100. We're going to say 100. And how many hours, my expert witness, the ward leader, do they work at those polling places?
At least 13 hours,
So it's probably more like 14 if you,
before and after
right.
preparation and closing, yes.
And that's all captured in the $10 to $11 million number that we
okay.
we gave you.
So if you go by an hourly rate of what those operators, those judges of election, they make, it comes out to approximately $7+ an hour. So let's be sure they ain't doing it for the money. And we have not given them a raise in how long?
I'm not sure. It's been a few years, I believe.
So there's voter participation going down. It's my understanding, let me ask the ward leader expert, that the number of these election operators are going down. And we just really need to focus on how to get more people to participate in the democratic process. So that's another priority that we have other than, campaign finance. We better take a look at that, or whether you're a Republican, and I have some on the committee, right? Do I have two? 2 Republicans and Democrats. So this is a bipartisan kind of thing. We better start to take a look at this whole process to make sure that in 10 years that we actually have people willing to participate in the democratic process, whether as a custodian of democracy in those election booths or as participants even going to the polls. So I think we're averaging like 20% turnout. Do I have a ward leader expert that can verify that?
Depends. It's probably when you put them all together, somewhere in that world.
20%. So we need to take a whole look at the whole department and figure out during the budget process how we encourage more people to be involved, whether it's electronic voting or those kinds of things that can actually stimulate more participation of the electorate, as well as the infrastructure of people who actually count our votes. And that was a statement, not a question.
Okay. Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Heenan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning.
Morning.
First, I want to thank the lead sponsor of this legislation, Councilman Green, for really, being forward-thinking in the direction and how we operate as an electoral and how we use our resources in a priority way. I think it's, kind of appropriate that we have these public discussions, and in lieu of a lot of the testimony, a lot of stakeholders, a lot of people on the streets I mean, Councilman Jones has, just hit the nail on the head. I mean, you have a lot of people who have been operating and conducting fair elections for a long, long time, and they don't do it for the money.
That's
all
for sure.
They don't do it for the money. They do it because it's the right thing to do as part of our civic duty and responsibility. And, I'm glad that Councilman Green had pointed out that in the overall budget, the cost is always going to be a factor, but 0.01% of our overall budget would be allocated if the voters, and that's a big if, because the voters should decide whether they want to have fair elections, more participation into our process. Because, I mean, when you're getting 8-9% voter participation, I mean, it's disheartening to see why there's such a lack of disconnect between government and the voters. And we're trying to change that. And this is a vehicle from a policy perspective, to really engage people in our communities to be a part of their neighborhood, to be a part of government, to have their voices be heard in more of a structured way. So a couple things that I wanted to point out, that this is a very minuscule part of our overall budget. What is our operating budget? 4.4 billion?
Yeah, a little over $4 billion. But then, as we talked about, a lot of that is fixed costs. A lot of it we really don't have discretion over.
What is our capital budget?
Capital budget, we're probably going to spend about 160, 170, it's in that
That's on the
range.
general obligation.
So our capital budget is a couple billion as well, though, right?
Well, that includes things like the airport and the water. If it's just, so you're talking about just the general obligation, it's about
$8 billion
$160.
city budget combined.
That's all funds, so that would
Right,
include
it's
all
all
grants,
funds. Right.
everything.
So we're talking about $8 billion, and, we're having a public conversation over 0.01% of engaging our public in good civic responsibility and a different way of seeing things. Change is difficult. A question on policy. I know you're the finance, and I'm not sure if you're taking a position on a policy, but as a policy in trying to get people engaged, does the administration feel that it is the right conversation to have on the policy itself?
I think it's a good conversation to have. We still have the concern about the cost.
Of
and
course,
what it
I mean,
means.
I understand it. I understand it. And I think what's great about having public hearings and having people who have experiences as best practices across the country is that, we should discuss a policy, then leading into any kind of finances, because everything we do, our tax delinquencies, our rate in which we, have conversations about our recovery and our tax delinquencies, our property assessments, whether we have the infrastructures in place to really capture, the increase of our property values. I'm not sure if we're missing an opportunity to do that. There was talks about a 2% cut and, across the board in our departments. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. The police department, they're recruiting currently for new police officers. Yes. So that's already been budgeted. Same thing with our fire department, already.
Yeah, but both departments are also seeing
so
pretty
we're
strong
still looking
challenges.
for public servants in our first responders. Is that correct?
Yes, we are looking to hire paramedics, particularly, and firefighters, as well as police officers.
Our IT department, we were looking to recruit people in our IT department.
Yeah,
that
we
we've already
we
budgeted
have a
for.
lot of positions that we want to fill throughout the city, which we budget for, but it still doesn't mean that we're necessarily at the point where we'd like to be with some of these departments in
we've
terms
allocated-
of staffing levels.
But we've appropriated and passed a budget for those positions, is that correct?
For some of those positions,
We
yeah.
have.
And we're still trying to fill them.
We are still trying to film, although we've asked mean, each of those departments is going through the process with us of looking for cuts within their departments.
And
The three that you mentioned.
there was, including the pension. We made some drastic changes in our pension, I think, over the last year with council's support and the administration's cooperation. So I think we should be funding, have our funding in place for an acceptable range, I think, within 7-8 years with the increase. Is that correct?
So our,
Not 30 years as it was. So I think we made progressive changes in our pensions.
so our plan would get us to 80% funded in 13 years. In terms of what's going on with employees, there have been changes so far for DC 33 and the FOP. We're still in the process with firefighters and with DC 47. So we've gotten part of what we were hoping to get, but we're not through that process.
Right. But, point is that, we do a lot of things at once. I'm proud that, the administration and this body and, Philadelphians are having the opportunity to discuss a policy like this that is, similar to what we had with sick pay and 21st century wage. It was a little bit outside the box, but it was good for people. And I think that's what makes Philadelphia better than most. And that's why we're a city of first class. So I appreciate the dialogue and the conversation and look forward to dealing with, the finances of this in 0.01% of our overall budget in the future. But I think agreeing on a policy is really important. And if we can get there on a policy, then, we'll continue the financial discussion. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none, Mr. Bowe, Ms. Adams, thank you.
Thank you.
You very much. Ms. Marconi, will you call our next panel, please? Rob, sorry, 1 second.
Sorry, Rob. Saw you getting excited. Sorry. Now, one quick question. I chair the budget hearings, so I'm always interested in so with respect, and I know you can't guarantee this, but we've got the 2 municipal contracts that we've resolved are both 10% increases across the board. Are they 10?
Oh, over multiple years.
Over the life of the contract.
Roughly, that's right. I think the 33 was more like in the 8 range, and police were more like 10.
All right. And I know you can't answer this question, I know, because of how savvy you are, you won't answer this question. But the likelihood is that the 2 remaining, and this is me saying this, remaining contracts will be approximately 8 to 10 over the life of the plan. That's normally, and I know you're not going to
Each negotiation has its own dynamic.
I know. Sad to put it out there.
He's been around a while, Councilman.
Yeah, you were so impressive, Rob.
He's the guy you want to rob the bank with.
Yeah, right. And the school district contract, in their 5-year plan, is there money budgeted from the city's side to fund that contract?
No. So I have to answer that in a couple of ways. So they're projecting $1 billion deficit over 5 years. They don't assume that there's additional city money beyond what we already give them to help fund that.
They don't assume it.
Yeah.
So there would not be any tax increases for,
Well, but they project $1 billion problem. So,
all right. So one doesn't jive with the other.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, that's good.
okay.
So,
All right.
thank you.
Hold on, one more. Councilman Green?
I'm sorry.
No, he's going to wait.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to follow up, Mr. DeBelle. You talked quite a bit in reference to the public financing legislation. What is your opinion on the other bill regarding the changes to the campaign finance laws?
Really, my testimony, I'm focused on the kind of the cost of the public financing changes.
Right, but but your testimony included both that as well as the other bill, which deals with cycle changes. So I wanted to get your perspective on that bill as well.
I don't really have a perspective on that.
You don't have an opinion one way or the other?
Right.
Okay. And although as I reflect on Council President Clark's commentary, I'm still going to ask this question. If money was not a concern, what would be your position?
My job would be so easy if money wasn't a concern.
Okay. So so I'll answer this for you. Your job is to focus on the numbers. You don't have a position.
I
on the
think,
bill.
I mean, as I said in response to the council meeting, I think it's a good conversation to have, and I think there are kind of issues that we'd need to talk through with it.
Okay. I have a game on Saturdays. I need another poker player, so I'll see if I can get you to play.
I say he's been around a while now. Come on. Councilwoman Bass?
I just had a quick question. Can you give us some sort of sense of, what similar cities have a public financing policy? What cities that are similar in size, and also in this region? Can you just give us some idea? Who else?
Actually, I have seen that. I don't have it with me, so we can get back to you on that.
Maybe the next
Sorry.
witnesses could probably talk about
Okay,
that a
very
little bit
good.
better. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Council President?
Real quick, I'm sorry. Sorry, Rob. I'm sorry. With respects to the school district's budget,
Yes.
and you indicated in their 5-year plan, they project having,
$976 million deficit through FY '22.
all right, but no need for additional city funding.
No, sorry, I may not have answered that well. What I was saying is that they have projections in their budget. Those projections don't include additional funding from us, but they do show a $976 million deficit. And obviously, we're going to have to figure out how that hole is going to be filled.
So was it a similar scenario over the last school five-year fiscal plan that required that we raise upwards of $479 million?
That's right.
So
So we're going to have to do something
it was a similar
there.
scenario where they had a 5-year plan that was not based on reality.
Right, that's right. There's something's going to have to happen there.
Yeah, we
That's right.
ultimately ended up, okay. I just want to make sure
Yeah, okay.
individuals understand that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. No other questions? Now you can go. Ms. Marconi, our next panel,
Michael
please.
Cook and David Thornburg.
Good morning. Again, Mr. Cook, I think we have your testimony already, so again, that will be made part of the record. If you could maybe summarize, because we have a lot of witnesses. Okay, so, Ms. Thornburg, I don't think we have yours yet, right?
I think it was passed out
Okay.
a little bit ago.
You have it now? Okay, all right. So again, the full testimony will be made part of the record. Whoever would like to go first, please identify yourself and proceed.
Good morning, Chair Greenlee. My name is Michael Cook, here to testify on behalf of the Board of Ethics. Good morning also Vice Chair Green, other members of the committee, Council President Clark. Thank you for this opportunity to speak on the proposed legislation. And I would like to note, of course, for the record, as you're all aware, the board has administered the city's public integrity laws since its inception in 2008, including the city's campaign, since its inception in 2006, including the city's campaign finance law, and I have myself been with the board since 2008. I'd like to thank members of the committee, and especially the sponsors of this legislation, for the opportunity to address this very important development for the city of Philadelphia. The board supports this proposed legislation and appreciates the opportunity we've had to work with members of City Council to craft it, and we think that the proposed legislation would offer numerous benefits to the citizens of Philadelphia. Indeed, we see it as the next step in the ethics and campaign finance reforms that began with the city's adoption through City Council's action of the city's campaign finance law and the creation of the Ethics Board in 2006. The proposed matching funds program would make Philadelphia elections cleaner and fairer. It would empower Philadelphians by amplifying the impact of small donations and would encourage candidates to focus their time and fundraising efforts on regular constituents, thereby diversifying the donor base. As for the nuts and bolts of the legislation itself, that's laid out in my testimony. I'm sure members are familiar with it. Just briefly note, the heart of the proposed legislation is matching funds. That is, that candidates who participated in the program would be eligible to receive a 5-to-1 match of any contributions of up to $150 from Philadelphia residents. The program would apply, of course, only to city elective office, mayor, council, district attorney, controller, sheriff, and city commissions, and not to the judicial or state elections, even if they're based in Philadelphia. The legislation would have caps on the amount of money that any single candidate could receive, spending limits, and would limit the amount of money participating candidates could accept from political committees. The proposed legislation, of course, in order to participate, candidates would have to go through a number of criteria in order to make sure that they were actually credible candidates and that it was a worthwhile and useful thing for the city to even be providing them the matching funds to begin with. Those criteria are laid out in the legislation. I won't go over them now. I will mention the one main part is that any candidate who wanted to participate would have to raise a certain amount of money in small dollar donations to demonstrate that they have that ability and commitment, and it's would be a significant hurdle for candidates if they wanted to participate in the program, but reachable for those who were committed to it. I'd like to talk a little bit about projected costs of the program. That was something that the finance director talked about, certainly very important, and wanted to lay that all before the members of the committee so you have all the information that you need. Under the proposed legislation, the board would be responsible for administering the program, and we appreciate council's confidence in the board's ability to do so and recognize the significant challenge of the undertaking. Given the scope of the proposed program, of course, the board would require a notable increase in its appropriation to cover the administration of the program. Based on the legislation as it's currently structured, and after examining how agencies in other jurisdictions administer similar programs, we estimate that the board would require up to 7 new full-time staff members. We would likely also make use of seasonal temporary employees during peak periods before elections. These folks would work on processing matching claims, developing the relevant regulations, the guidance documents, providing trainings, and helping candidates with compliance and audit of their participation in the program. All told, for salaries and administrative costs, such as office build-out and computer equipment, we estimate that if the program were in effect for the 2019 elections, for fiscal year 2019, the board would need an additional appropriation of approximately $685,000 to $755,000. I should note that that estimate does not include the cost of developing or maintaining software to process matching fund requests and disbursements. When Seattle recently implemented a public financing program, they spent approximately $300,000 on software development. I've had the opportunity to begin discussions with OIT and the Records Department to see whether it would be possible to combine development of software for this program with an upcoming upgrade of the software we use for the filing of campaign finance reports, also exploring whether we can license software from other jurisdictions in order to reduce costs and streamline the implementation of the program. So that's the administrative cost. The other big piece of the cost for the program, of course, is the matching funds that would have to be provided to candidates. And that will vary depending on how many candidates are participating and will certainly be at its peak in those years when there's a primary election, particularly when there is the election for city council, mayor, commissioners, and sheriff. That's the time with the heaviest election activity. According to an analysis by the Campaign Finance Institute, which I believe members have as submitted as part of testimony, if the proposed program had been in place in 2015, the city would have dispersed between $5 million to $6 million in matching funds for the primary election. using that data point and then taking into consideration the number of candidates in past city elections and participation rates for public financing programs in other jurisdictions, we think on the high end, it is reasonable to estimate matching fund disbursements of $8 million to $10 million over a 4-year cycle. That would, if you then add in the administrative costs, average out to about $3 million per year over a 4-year period. Most of those expenditures, of course, they wouldn't be evenly spread out. The heaviest expenditure periods would be in the fiscal year during which the primary elections for mayor and council occur, as I mentioned earlier. I'd like to note, though, that that is the estimates for the program as currently proposed in the legislation. There are many ways to scale and manage the cost of this kind of program if council were to feel that you liked the policy idea, but thought it would only be appropriate with a different cost structure. And there are several options at your disposal if you choose to do that. For example, you could lower the matchable amount of a contribution. So currently it's proposed that 150 would be matched at 5-to-1. If that stayed the same, then a participating candidate would have to get at least contributions from at least 133 donors in order to hit the funding cap of 100,000 for someone who's running for a council or sheriff or commissioner. If the amount was lowered to 100, then a candidate would need 200 donors to hit that funding cap. At $50, a candidate would need 400 donors. The more donors that are required to hit the funding cap, then fewer candidates will reach the cap and the city would spend less money on the matching funds. Should note that lowering the matchable amount would also enhance the policy goal of encouraging candidates to diversify their donor base because they would have to go to more people to raise the money. It would also, on the other hand, have the impact of making it harder for candidates to qualify for the program in the first place because in order to reach the qualification threshold, they would have to raise money from more people than they do under the current proposal. Just wrap up, note a couple of other ways to substantially reduce the amount of matching funds required by the program. One would be to eliminate mayoral races from the program. They're currently in there as having a cap of $1 million per mayoral candidate. Removing them would significantly lower the projections. If you look at that analysis that was done by the Campaign Finance Institute, I believe that included about $2 million of matching funds for mayoral candidates, so that would cut that projection almost in half, or by a third if you're looking at the higher end. You could also lower the funding cap for some races such as DA or controller, which are currently set at $300,000. Or council, especially if it has concerns about the financial situation for fiscal year 2019, could delay the start of the program until the 2021 DA and controller elections. That would require the city to spend less money in the near term and also stagger and spread out the implementation costs for the administrative side of things as well. So that concludes my testimony, and I would be happy to answer any questions that members may
All right.
have.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. Before, we're going to hear from Mr. Thornburg, then we'll be open to questions. But before we do that, Mr. Thornburg, I want to recognize Councilman Jones, who has some special guests here he'd like to recognize. Councilman?
And I'm sure as we discuss democracy, I think it's truly appropriate to welcome to our chambers surviving members of the Tuskegee Airmen, escorted by Dr. Joyce Spraggins and one you may remember a Philadelphian by the name of Wally Jones, who is the young upstart escorting them because he's young. We have Nathan Thomas, who is 91 years young. We have Dr. Eugene Richardson, who is 92 years young. We have Ms. Catherine Johnson, who is 99 years young, capped off by a 100-year-old Tuskegee Airman, let me get the name, Ernest Jones. Can we welcome them to our chambers?
Gentlemen. Thank you, sir. Where did you? Wait, take a picture.
We'd like to take a photo and say good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm actually a constituent of City Councilman Jones, and our goal is to help NASA. We're doing a program with NASA and the astronauts. We work with 6 retired astronauts. We'll be supporting astronaut X, when she goes aboard the International Space Station in 2018. We will be working with all of City Council so that all the youth in the city will have an opportunity to witness history, as well as Mrs. Catherine Johnson. So it's an honor for us to be here. We know that Councilman Bass do a lot in your community. We'd like to thank you. And Mr. President Darrell Clark, it is truly an honor to be here in your council, and we are looking for students all over the world to know that you can be a president of City Council, and this is all a part of history. So we want to say thank you. And to Mr. Jones, could you come forward? He is 100 years old.
I have to say it this way. I met your mayor last year. We were down at Sugar House. I have a picture of him in my door. Take you with me. I won $50.
And he's also an Overbrook High School alumni.
Well, I have to say something, Councilman Curtis here, because in our West Side Weekly, I'm talking about his skating rink. Yes, why not?
You had a right.
Did you rent him any skates yet?
The rec department has 100 skates for them.
Oh, that's nice.
Are you planning on joining us?
I'm gonna try to skate. Well, it's good to see everyone here, and I've been in here before a couple of times, but it's when Mayor Good and Brother Clark, he's been around a long time. President.
Not quite as long as you do.
Well, I have enough to say. It's good to be with you. I was, maybe you don't know, I was Fast Master of Camelot for Chapel number 37. And 30 years as a secretary. 32nd degree, is that all right for you now? That's all right. That was enough. Take care.
If we can just get a photo real quick, and we don't mean to interrupt council. Okay. Okay, all right, so. If everyone could just come at the Tuskegee Airmen, and Wally, if you could come very quickly in front of the podium, right here, is that what you're saying, Council? Everybody can be seated, okay.
This is my dad, first off. This is my dad.
Oh, sure, I know, yeah. That's a good policy.
Where did it fall? Yeah, you sit here at the bottom. Just,
Sorry for the interruption,
No,
Mr.
no,
Chairman.
it was for a good cause. If we could.
President don't get excited, huh?
Yeah, right. I had to educate the council president. He said Wally Jones to get us way before. He was out
That's right. Go ahead.
60-17,
Go ahead,
man. I
that's
know
right.
them all.
Oh, we know.
I know
You are a
them all.
sports historian.
Especially back then. I used to follow. Buddy used to get us on credentials. You could stand right there. All right. 40 games.
All right.
Okay? Why don't we try to get started? I'm sorry. Yes. No. I could do it.
100 years old.
I'm sure you understand the interruption there. That was for a very good reason, okay? So, Ms. Thornburg, excuse me, please
Thank you.
identify
No,
yourself.
it's a great honor to be preempted by the Tuskegee Airmen, I must say.
Absolutely.
We're here to talk about strengthening democracy, and without folks like that, we wouldn't be here today. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Council President, members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be with you today to talk about this this measure. Your interest in, and if it's okay, I'm just going to summarize my testimony here.
Strongly prefer that, sir. Thank you.
You have it in front of you. These questions of how we increase the engagement of our citizens in our local democracy is something that has motivated the Committee of 70 since we were founded over 100 years ago. So I appreciate your leadership on this. Particularly now, we live in extraordinary times in terms of people's attitudes about politics and government, from the national to the local. I was struck recently, and this is in my testimony, that probably a number of you are familiar with the statewide poll that Terry Madonna runs out of Franklin Marshall that asks people across Pennsylvania about what's on their mind. And since August of 2015, the most important issue that people identify facing the Commonwealth is something about the state of government and politicians. Most recently, that number was about 30% people identified as the most important issue facing the Commonwealth. And what's particularly striking is that is about 3 times as high as their concern about any other issue: schools, crime, taxes, opioid crisis, what have you. Now, that doesn't split the numbers out for Philadelphia. Could be some variation, but I think we are in a time when these fundamental questions of democracy and how people engage in that democracy are very, very important. Having said that, I listened to the testimony from Rob Dubois and some of your questions, and I think we have to approach any expenditure of dollars that doesn't focus on the core ingredients of a growing and healthy city. We have to apply an extra level of scrutiny to those dollars. We're never in an environment where money is not an object, and today that's particularly true. If there were a way in this, in pursuing this proposal where we could identify some real or related cost reductions in other parts of the budget that would make some coherent, sort of a coherent package, I think that would certainly be one way to get what we wanted. I was here about a year ago. I think Councilman Heenan and Councilman Green had kind of an informational, maybe Councilman Greenlee, I apologize, I can't remember, had an informational hearing on this issue. And I said at the time, and this is kind of a general all-purpose observation, that it was very important to try to understand the goals that we were trying to achieve through this legislation, and then having settled on the goals, we obviously would have an easier job, not an easy, but an easier job of matching up the solution to the problem. In this case, having looked at a lot of the research that's been out there, if we define the problem we're trying to solve as engaging more citizens, particular citizens who have not participated in financing campaigns, if we identify the problem as encouraging those folks through this to participate in funding campaigns, I think it seems clear to me that this approach of public financing will achieve that. I think there's ample evidence out there that suggests that will happen. Having said that, though, there are other issues that are other potential problems or challenges that I don't think it is terribly clear that this will address. And I will also suggest there's a whole raft of issues that are of concern to us as to the robust and vigorous nature of our local democracy that we ought to be paying a lot of attention to. So I will give, for the time being, and I know there's, as Councilman Green said, there's much discussion to be had, but I think we are supportive of that piece of the intent and the potential impact of this legislation, but would love to join a broader conversation about other issues that I think head in the same direction. So let me just go through kind of the three main questions that we use to evaluate this proposal, and I've said something about them already, but just to drill down a little bit first. The first question is, will this promote greater citizen participation in the political fundraising process? And I think, again, the answer there, as judged by the evidence that we have, is yes. I think in particular, I know I have some testimony from the Campaign Finance Institute in Washington. I think that is a credible, balanced source of insight on these. They've taken a look at every city and state that has implemented programs like this, and there seems to be a clear sense that if we implemented a small dollar matching fund in Philadelphia, that would encourage more small dollars from citizens who maybe historically have not participated in that process. And as the research points out, that is because the campaigns understand the value of those $25 or $50 or $100 contributions because they're leveraged by the public dollars that are budgeted for those purposes. So I think, again, as best as we can tell from the evidence that's out there, that is a pretty unambiguous yes. And that is, that's an important goal, as I said at the outset, particularly at a time when a lot of people are questioning the very structure of our democracy and whether it's worth participating at all, as judged by, we had a discussion of turnout and so forth and so on. So another question that is often asked of schemes like this is, will it foster more competition in local elections? And there I think the jury is out, maybe, but probably not. One observation is that in many jurisdictions, New York among them, that have small dollar matching programs, they also have term limits. And term limits cause a natural turnover in elected positions that bring about competition and bring new candidates to the field. And since we don't have them here, it's a little hard to disentangle the effect of one from the other, but I think we're confident in our conclusion that that piece of that kind of goal would not be addressed by this proposal. Third question is, will this enable a broader and more diverse range of candidates to run for office? So a goal that supporters bring to this often is that we want to encourage more people and more diverse people, more people who have not maybe traditionally considered elected office to run for office. I think the evidence there, again, suggests kind of a hesitant maybe, but not sure. Again, if we don't have natural turnover built into the process, we may end up with more candidates, but we'll say not more viable candidates. There was one piece of research that summarized a lot of what we know in this area, and they stated that as far as we can tell, the public funding does not dramatically alter the decision calculus of quality candidates thinking about entering the ring. Also, the fact that our elections are, as they say, first past the post, that there are no runoff provisions in any of our elections. We could end up in a situation where there are more candidates divvying up the total vote in such a way so that the winner ends up with a smaller vote total. And we don't believe that electing a council person or district attorney or what have you with, 20% of the vote is necessarily good for our local democracy. There are a couple of modifications that we would encourage you to consider. Points been made about the potential to exclude the mayoral election from the proposal, both based on the budget impact and, in our view, the fact that that race already gets in a lot of attention and is a higher turnout race than some of the others. We also would suggest not including the sheriff and the city commissioners. Some of you know we have long called for the elimination of those offices. We find that they're outdated and unnecessary, and it would seem disingenuous for us to support a proposal that sustained them going forward, given our past positions. You might also consider a sunset provision in the legislation, which would give us all the ability to experience the proposal in some way, shape, or form, and then come back to it, require us to come back to it to make modifications. And then, seconding what Michael Cook said, we could also look at the leverage, the matching formula to reduce the budgetary impact. When New York first introduced the matching formula back in the late 80s, I think it was just a 1-to-1 matching, and they've changed that matching formula several different times. So I just wanted to raise a couple of issues that are of great concern to us that this proposal does not address. And you could say, well, it wasn't intended to address that, but these are issues that I think deserve a great deal of our attention. One is, like a lot of folks, we're very concerned about the rising tide of super PAC spending and independent expenditures on local elections. The $1.7 million spent in the district attorney's primary, I think, is the shape of things to come, and it raises a great deal of concern that increasingly electoral outcomes in Philadelphia will be determined by non-Philadelphians, by the wealthy individuals and labor unions and corporations that contribute to super PACs. Building this pyramid, the base of the pyramid of small dollar donors helps dilute that to some extent, but there may also be, if you are interested in taking this up and share our concerns, there may be more direct approaches to that. I noted that just recently in the City Council of St. Petersburg, Florida, that they passed an ordinance banning super PAC contributions and expenditures in those elections. Almost undoubtedly will be challenged in court, but I think notable that your colleagues in another city have tried to attack that issue head on. Second issue I want to raise, because I think this is relevant if we're talking about political engagement, is to acknowledge that we have a partisan primary system that, because of the way it's constructed, effectively disenfranchises over 100,000 people, voters in the city of Philadelphia who don't happen to be registered as Democrats or Republicans. They literally sit on their hands on primary day. They get to vote on charter change issues, but they don't have a meaningful say in meaningful elections. And as some of you know, most cities in this country, most big cities have nonpartisan or open primaries, which gives those folks a voice in those elections. Again, not the focus of this proposal, but I think we have to keep that in mind as we talk about how we engage people in the political process. It's worth noting that there's research that suggests as many as half of young voters, newly registered voters, don't register in one of the political parties anymore. And that if that's true in Philadelphia, then we're not exactly putting out the welcome wagon for them, the welcome mat in our local elections. Finally, you all know that we have had great concerns about the Office of City Commissioners here. We find it inefficient, ineffective, and basically leaderless. The Office of the City Commissioners, just the office of those 3 individuals and their staff, costs us about $1 million a year. That's $1 million, about $1 million more than any other county in the Commonwealth, and their performance does not merit that. We saw anecdotally 3-hour lines in some North Philadelphia polling places in November, and I was here about a month ago. Senator Hughes had an informational hearing, part of which was taken up with the fact that the Office of City Commissioners processed about 17,000 voting applications late this last go-round, which was almost 20 times higher rate than Allegheny County, the second largest county in the Commonwealth. So, and I believe sincerely that the conduct of that office does in fact discourage people from participating in elections and in political engagement. So I'll conclude by saying we find things to like in this proposal. As I said, we are convinced that it would in fact broaden the base of small dollar donors because we're applying public funds to leverage those dollars, and would look forward to the chance to work with you to make modifications to that proposal as I discussed, but also in an ongoing basis would love to reserve some time to tackle some of these issues, which I think are as important, if not more important, in affecting the willingness of folks in Philadelphia to get involved in the political process. So thank you
Mr.
again
Thornburg.
for the
Thank you.
opportunity to testify.
Okay, thank you. Let me just answer a couple of quick questions. I know we've got people waiting. I apologize. But first, let me make a quick statement. And I know as we talked with Mr. DeBow about finances, and the issue of the policy came in here. And I want to be clear, because I want to be upfront with people. And I think I said this at that informational hearing we had about a year ago. And I know there's difference of opinion on this panel about this. I don't particularly agree with the policy of the public paying for people to help people run for election out of the general tax base. And I say this as someone who, and I would challenge anybody to abhor fundraising more than me. I hate it, okay? But I just think to reach into the city budget to help people pay for running for office, I just do not agree with that policy. That's my personal opinion. Like I said, I know other people have opinions the other way. So I just want to get that on the record so people understand where I'm coming from on this. Mr. Cook, two quick things. One, and I was going through your written testimony to see if I could find it. You said something about that this will help elected officials sort of deal with I'm paraphrasing what you said, the average person or the everyday person more. You said something like...
I wouldn't put it that way,
Okay.
Mr. Chair. Certainly one of, or maybe the primary goal, policy goal of the proposed legislation is that it creates powerful incentives for candidates, whoever may be running for office, to connect with everyday citizens who can provide limited small dollar contributions, and that because it provides the matching funds, it creates that incentive. And so it encourages the candidates to focus their fundraising on those smaller donor folks as opposed to political committees or wealthy individuals.
Okay, so you're talking about candidates, not necessarily as an elected official.
Oh, candidates.
Okay,
yes.
all right. I will say one thing on that, though, as a candidate, and I think I know something about this when I'm out there. I certainly interact with the general public way more than I interact with whatever you would call big PACs or whatever. We go to 4 or 5 meetings a night, and that's usually with the general public, with the average person out there. So I just want to put that on record. I think right now, we do interact with the general public a whole lot, and they're the ones that eventually do vote. And I would agree, I'd like to see 100% voter participation, but, I think we certainly do interact with the average person right now. One other issue, and Ms. Sternberg, I think you did say this, that you did not see this as necessarily increasing the amount of participation of candidates in an election, right? Or the diversity as such. Am I saying that right? Or?
Yeah, and I included in my written testimony a little chart that comes from the Campaign Finance Institute that addresses some of these questions. And they, again, I think are a very balanced, measured source, and I think that's their conclusion, that it's, at least many of these things, it's just hard to tell.
Okay.
It's hard to disentangle one thing from the next, so I didn't find that evidence conclusive.
Okay, I appreciate that, because I notice, I think we do have, and obviously, city council at large candidates is something I kind of pay attention to, since I'm one of them. And we've had, just in the last election, we had 23 candidates. In 11, we also had 23 total, Democrat and Republican, and 24 in 2007. So, and as I look at the list, I know something about the people that ran. It's a pretty diverse list of people. So I would say that I don't think that, right now, I don't think that's a problem. I think we have people of diverse backgrounds running for office and, being involved in the process, at least in that fashion. All right, I know other people have questions. Let me go to, first, let me record reflect Councilwoman Gim, member of the committee, is present. First, Councilman Green, Councilman O, and then Councilman Heenan. Oh, I'm sorry, Council President Clark, too.
Last.
Where were you? Where were you?
They were for me.
Okay, Councilman Green. Huh? I did. I had O'Neill. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your testimony. There's been a lot of conversation today regarding this legislation, regarding the cost, which is something I'm also very concerned about. In both of your testimonies, you talked about ways to reduce the cost impacts of this legislation, both by taking out the mayoral election and also by lowering the matching amount. And I guess the question I would have, if you made those changes, if you can give an approximate idea of what you think the reduction would be in means of actually costs of this going forward, and if those changes would take away from some of the policy goals of this legislation.
So I think regarding the effect of eliminating the mayoral races, that we don't know in the future how many mayoral candidates would participate. It may be that there would be high participation, it may be that there would be low participation, but no matter what, mayoral candidates have by far the highest amount of public funding that they could receive under the proposed legislation. So a mayoral candidate could get up to $1 million in public funding, and so if you even had 2 candidates in a 5-candidate field who hit that's $2 million right there. And when you subtract that $2 million, you're talking about a substantial savings. In terms of the policy implications for removing the mayor, I think that as I think Mr. Thornburg might have alluded to, that's a race that does already have a fairly high level of attention and high level of fundraising activity and bigger campaigns and so on. So I think that the impact would be less pronounced. I do think that it would be a benefit to the city to have this program available for mayoral candidates for all the same reasons of the policy being good for city elections overall, but I think the impact on a policy level would be much less severe than removing other elected offices. Regarding the matchable amount, I think that it is difficult to predict a dollar amount of potential reductions, but it is certainly the case that by making it harder for candidates to hit their $100,000 or $300,000 cap, less are going to do so. The particularly good thing about that proposal is, while it has the aspect of cost reduction, it actually also forwards the policy goal of the proposed legislation, because in order to hit their cap, then candidates would have to raise from more individuals and at a lower level, which puts it more within the reach of regular everyday citizens. So that's something where you get a benefit in both directions.
And then one last question. Do either of you have any opinions on the cycle bill?
I think we both do. I think that is an important secondary feature of this bill. It brings it into, it's my understanding, it brings it into alignment with how fundraising cycles are calculated in other elections, and I think it levels the playing field in an important way.
I would say to that from our view, the main benefits of that change are to make the system significantly easier for candidates to comply with, and particularly in the context of the public funding program, where candidates are going to have to do a level of accounting to track their small dollar contributions, not having to worry about 4 separate contribution limit periods is going to be tremendously beneficial to them. It also gives candidates flexibility about when they want to raise the money from donors without having, frankly, a somewhat arbitrary cutoff of December 31st and January 1st for each particular year.
Okay. Thank you, Councilman. Councilman O?
Thank you very much, Chairman. For Mr. Thornburg, just, in terms of your opinion, I'm interested because my impression is that the reason why people complain about government is they're not happy with the results. And it doesn't necessarily indicate that things are not going according to the way that they voted. For example, they voted for a right-wing candidate, they voted for a left-wing candidate, and things aren't going the way they like. I would think that gerrymandering is a major problem as to what is wrong with elections and people's dissatisfaction. Gerrymandering in these very odd, perverted shapes of like 3 crescent moons, I think is going to get you a very particular set of perspectives in a community that otherwise is probably full of diverse people. And you're going to end up with very particular representatives who will not compromise or budge. Gerrymandering, more than anything else, appears to me to be the first practical problem, and I'm not saying it's an easy problem based on the laws, the courts, and all that. The second thing, and I don't want to give you too much, but I'm just trying to give you like the main things that I would like to get your response on from Committee of 70. The second thing is that lowering the bar for people to be able to be candidates. That, in fact, has been done to a large extent by social media, where people can get their message out, send out videos. Technology certainly has helped a lot, and people in these past 2 presidential elections for President Obama and for President Trump have given lots of money, made lots of statements, have been fully engaged, and we have a new problem called fake news and the Russians and all that, but that's yet another problem. But certainly the engagement of people on social media as candidates and otherwise is certainly robust as far as what we can see, and has provided new avenues for people to get engaged as never before. But still, the ability to get on the ballot many times has to do with the obstructions along the way that cause people who are interested in running to not be able to get on the ballot. And they're there many times for good reasons, such as you have to make sure you live in the right area, You're actually a citizen. But there's also a lot of obstructions along the way that discourage people from participating in the race. So for me, lowering or removing obstructions that are unnecessary and making it easier for people to run for elections would be kind of more of a focus on my part. Gerrymandering, lowering the bar of obstructions. And then finally, one thing that is very difficult to deal with, which I always hear because I do a lot of speaking, as you do, people say, I would run, but I just don't want to get smeared. Smearing seems to be, to me, a big reason why normal people, good people, don't want to run. They understand that when you run for office, you get horribly smeared, embarrassed, your family gets attacked, that type of thing, and they just don't want to do it. Would you address those three issues? And you may say, well, those aren't very important issues, or you may say important, but what could we do about those?
Sure. Well, I guess I'd begin by saying, that that poll number that I suggested, that this is what's on people's minds, the state of government and politics. You'd obviously have to get inside that poll and talk to a lot of folks who try to make sense of that. So in and of itself, I do think that not just post last November, but building up to that, there is an anger and a frustration about the system, and I think in the presidential campaign that came from Bernie Sanders voters and Donald Trump voters, from the far right and the far left, and I think this is extraordinary. I do think it's more than just the outcomes that are being produced. I would totally agree with you about the impact of gerrymandering. You may have read we're very active on that issue around the Commonwealth. I think that is, as a colleague of mine says, one of the principal bugs in the operating system of democracy. And we got our work cut out for us to reverse that. There's no right answer to what kind of bar you should be able to clear to run for office. And there are a lot of things going there, and you may be right that people's fear of being publicly attacked or smeared or to have their family brought into it is one powerful thing. I think it's important to recognize in this proposal there is a threshold that you would have to meet in order to participate in the funding process. Basically, you'd have to prove that you were able to attract a certain number of small dollar donors before this kicked in. And that level can be adjusted depending, if we think it's too high or too low. I apologize, Councilman O, I'm blanking on your second question.
Smear, I think
I got the smear, I got gerrymandering.
I think you hit them all three.
Okay.
Gerrymandering, smearing, and lowering the bar of obstacles. So I'll make my next question for both you and Mr. Cook. So I will say that me in particular, I do certainly encourage people to participate in elections. I am generally in agreement with Councilman Greenlee that we have a lot of things to pay for with our taxes, and if we didn't have to pay for them by some miracle, we should reduce taxes and let people spend their own money. If they want to run for office, run for office. But the question is how to get them engaged, and for me, I would say that my problem with understanding this proposal, and I'm open-minded, glad you're here to tell me what is wrong with what I'm thinking. This bill seems to raise the floor. It doesn't reduce the ceiling. So if the concern is increasing the cost of elections, the cost of elections continue to rise because there's a couple things you can't control. PACs and dark money. You cannot do anything about PACs and engaging PACs, and so this bill appears to me to give more power to power brokers. The bosses of the machine, the bosses of whatever conglomerates of power who tend to be the ones who broker who runs and who doesn't. Because anyone who participates in this generally has smaller dollar amounts. If they could get more money, they wouldn't participate. If they were personally wealthy, maybe they wouldn't. But for the person you're trying to reach, if they agree to this, they get a certain level, so the floor rises, but they're competing against people that can have a lot of money spent, a lot of non-money in volunteer hours, hours, sweat equity, other things, and then people who can spend millions of dollars without their consent, so to speak, and we see that. This bill does not do anything to prevent that, and so there are not that many power brokers out there. And so for the average person who wants to run, now they have to go see a power broker or they just don't know one. I would think that if you're going to encourage people to run, you may try to assist them through a nonprofit fund of some sorts, whereby every candidate who enters is eligible for some type of basic candidate's kit. You get some public media through our government access channel or through some other type of thing, or some posters or whatever you do to some extent. If the person just didn't have enough money of a certain level, they were a candidate that was unfunded, that might encourage them. But however, again, my concern is that the process here would, because everything's relative. Yes, somebody may have more money at the bottom who never had that money, but the people at the top will have more money. They will respond with more dollars to address that. And so the issue for me is that if you want more people to participate, you need to lower the overall cost of elections, and you need to try to level the playing field as much as possible. And the unfortunate thing is we cannot just cap elections, because the Supreme Court has said that a corporation or anyone else can throw in $3 million to a city council race as long as they don't coordinate with anybody, and then you have all this stuff out there. Super PACs or just PACs can do the same, and they can distribute money around to other PACs and other organizations, and it's not a thing this bill addresses. So it still leaves the fact that the few very wealthy, capable, politically astute have a lot of ability to give tremendous favor to their candidates. Could you address that?
Certainly, Councilman. And I would say that you certainly identify concerns that many people have with the way elections are conducted in this country, especially in the past few years with the rise of super PACs and independent spending that we've seen at the federal level and some degree in Philadelphia. And I think, as you pointed out, the frustration for a lot of people is you can't prevent it, given the Constitution and the First Amendment and the Supreme Court. It's simply not possible to tell people that they can't spend money to promote the candidates of their choice independently. So no matter what, that's going to continue in some form or fashion. As you say, it is not possible to lower the ceiling. And so I think from the perspective of the sponsors, and they could certainly speak to it better than I can, they look at the situation and say, well, we want to improve this situation. If we can't lower the ceiling, as you say, perhaps we can raise the floor. And that seems to me to be an excellent legislative response to the particular situation, and one that also has the related benefit of encouraging that greater engagement between candidates and members of the public, because not all candidates are as good as that as some of the members who are here today. And so for them to have that incentive is a very powerful thing. And so I think that it's certainly true, the concerns that you raise, and that this bill would in fact address them in ways that are possible for council to do so, recognizing the limits based on the Constitution and Supreme Court rulings.
I would just say it's important to remember, well, two things. One is this program will work if candidates opt in. And I think the experience at the federal level with the checkoff on your tax returns is that increasingly, I can't remember the last major candidate who opted into that, which tells you that it's not working, that there are too many ways to raise money alternatively. So trying to get that right in Philadelphia, if this were to go forward, is really important. The second thing is that in participating in the program, you have to agree to, I guess, spending limits, right? So that does, in fact, level the playing field among candidates who have opted into the program. So
I don't want to interrupt, but while I agree with that, I think the bigger picture is, so you and I may agree to spending limits, but I've got XYZ Corporation behind me, and they throw $1 million into this race. So you've agreed to a spending limit. You're stuck, and I'm happy to be stuck because I got $1 million behind me. How would you address that?
Well, Councilman, actually, the participating candidate would not be stuck, because if either an opponent or an outside actor were to spend more than the limit for all candidates, including the participants, would be lifted. So that would give the participating candidate the opportunity to spend above what had been the limit to counter that.
So let me make sure I'm clear on what you're saying. David Thornburg and I are both candidates. We agree to this bill. We have spending limits. Somewhere back there, Corporation B starts spending $3 million, unrelated to me, just starting out, vote for David O, vote for David O. And because of that, candidate Thornburg says, hey, look at all this money being spent. We don't know exactly how much. We won't know till after the election. We don't know how much money is being spent. We can't even predict how much, because the television commercials, the cable, all that may come on election day, and then there may be an army of people out there on election day. And we could maybe calculate, if we find some direct mail and all that, we might be able to calculate, but I don't know how we're going to know how much is going to be spent, enough for David Thornburg to be able to say, other than the fact that what you're saying is he's now not limited somehow to his spending limit agreement. And then I guess I wouldn't be either, right? So we're both not.
So for participating candidates, yes, the limit would be lifted if an outside PAC or corporation or whatever it may be were to spend more than the spending limit. And that's actually not that hard to determine, because they are, in fact, required to file campaign finance reports. The council 2 years ago, in fact, enhanced the reporting requirements for those type of entities to make them have to file more regularly in the time period leading up to an election. So those spending amounts are, in fact, knowable and would allow the board to do that kind of calculation and then certify the lifting of the spending limits for that race.
If I could, do you have any more questions?
I'm done. Thank you.
Because,
Thank you
we
very
have a lot
much.
of people still here, and I know there's some members who want to ask questions. I didn't want to interrupt, but I think we need to keep moving. First, let me recognize Councilwoman Sanchez is present. Councilman Heenan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, both for your testimony. I love having public policy discussions. And I'm going to say it again. This is great to hear this kind of dialogue, because I see some testimony, and I've heard some other stuff that people don't even read the bill, and they're just making assumptions off of politics instead of policies, which is a disgrace and a shame for the whole process. But that's besides the point. Councilman and colleague had mentioned something about super PAC money and disclosures. I think part of the discussion that you were talking about here between the two of you was, in First Amendment rights and some outside money like a Soros or the Koch brothers, who have more money than we could spend in a lifetime. But when they come in, what we can do as a city is make some of the tools that we have to our ability to hold them a little more accountable, like disclosure. All right, so before, and I'm just using that example, all right? So while we can't prevent, nor should we prevent First Amendment right, we are bound by the Supreme Court decision in Citizens United. But we have taken steps, right? Like we are having these conversations on policy with public finance of elections. We have taken steps to hold some of that resources accountable for self-disclosing. All right, they're required to disclose where it would be 30 or 60-day post, cycle or two after the election, if it was in one of those 527s that had to report. So now we know before where some of the money's coming. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct, Councilman. And we spend almost every day, in the city of Philadelphia. We don't realize that actually Philadelphia leads the nation in these kind of attempts to address these issues. The reporting requirements and our rules regarding coordination of expenditures. Philadelphia has been in the vanguard of trying to ensure
Exactly.
this.
So we have been, and the point I'm trying to make, although we cannot prevent outside entities coming in from national resources or individual wealthy individuals, there are things that we have taken steps progressively on, such as reporting requirements and disclosures prior to the election, which was in the past. So I think that's a good step. And what we're trying to do here with public finance of an election is, although it's on a larger scale, change the paradigm on how we behave and how we report and how we engage. And I think we've proven that. We created the Board of Ethics. We created a lot of tweaks since that. So when Mr. Thornburg, you were talking about coming back and sunsetting and seeing what works and what doesn't work, and we've done that in just our zoning codes. We had took 3 years to reform our zoning codes, and then we took a year off to see what worked and didn't work, and we're able to tweak and modify as needed.
Right.
Because there's going to be, there's no perfect system, right? But there's no reason why we shouldn't be moving towards changing behavior or changing policies that make sense. And when we talk about, I think disenfranchise has been mentioned, but we're talking policy, and when we're talking about 0.018 in reference to or regarding disenfranchising voters or potential candidates, I don't think that there's a and I'm not saying that you said that, but I'm just saying, like, there's a very little amount of public dollars should not disenfranchise candidates who are eligible for public funding, is what I'm saying. It's just a fundamental philosophy. The chairman thinks, has some questions and fundamentally has some good public policy concerns. My concerns are that when is a good time? Right? If we wait for a good time, we're going to be retired. Right? We're going to miss the opportunities for more people to get engaged and get involved and be good public servants. So there is no good time. Right? Last I heard, the teachers were hiring, right, and holding seminars throughout the city, hiring school teachers. So I think we're on the right steps. And I do have a question for both of you. Do you feel that a policy like this should be up to the voters?
I do, yeah. I think it has to, the way you framed it, but I do think, because, not only is it you're asking them to either affirm or either approve or disapprove a choice about their dollars, but this also would be a reasonably significant change to the rules of the game by which we operate our local elections and local democracy, and I think people need a voice in that.
I would agree with that. I think it's excellent that if council decides to send this to the ballot question, that then the citizens of Philadelphia will have the opportunity to decide whether or not it's something they want.
So when the purpose of there's several purposes of the policy aside changing, the system, right, that everybody complains about. This is a good way to do it because we've proven to do so a little at a time, right, which has been effective. And the reason why we change things is because something either needs to be tweaked or something's wrong. But when I remember when I was running in 2011, and my best financial support in the form of a contribution was my friend's father, who was a retired World War II veteran, who gave me $20. He wrote me a $20 check, right? And I wasn't even going to cash it. I wasn't even going to put it in the bank. I was going to frame it. That's how much it meant to me, but it meant that much more to him. And I think the purpose of this policy is for low-dollar supporters, contrary to my fundraising ability, right? So to focus in on people, all right? Citizens that can't afford to raise a lot of money or contribute a lot of money, all right? They can contribute $50, $20, $100, $150. So I think it's important to take a look at the real reason why this is about, not to secure incumbency, not to raise the ceiling or anything like that, and not to engage in party politics and say, well, this is what's wrong with with everything else, without even understanding the true purpose of the policy. Two things, and I'll let you go, Chairman. I'll stop. Can you talk about, Mr. Cook, the eligibility? Because it's not, so anybody can run for office, and anybody has that, right. We fought for that right independently, and it's how our country was founded. So anybody can run, but it's not as easy as one would think to be eligible to be a candidate to qualify for matching funds, but two, certainly, to reach its limit of allowable funds possible. So that's one. And the other two things, other top cities, you talk about, the effect on other top cities and the participation rate in the public financing in other cities. So eligibility and other city research and participation.
Certainly. Regarding the eligibility, you're correct that there are a number of steps that a candidate would have to take in order to be eligible for the program. The first is that the candidate needs to be on the ballot. You have to have an opponent. There's no reason for the city to provide public funding to somebody who doesn't actually have an opponent. The candidate would have to be current on all required campaign finance reports, would have to be current on any debts owed to the city so that the city's not providing money to someone who owes it money, that the candidate will have agreed to comply with the terms of the program, which has a number of limitations and restrictions on how candidates can spend money. There's the spending limit and the limit on PAC money and so on. And then the big piece is that the candidate has to demonstrate their ability to actually raise from small donor contributions. So a candidate for mayor would have had to, just to be eligible, have raised at least $50,000 and contributions are $150 or less from Philadelphia residents, or if for any other office, it would be $15,000 in contributions of $150 or less. So those are fairly robust requirements for eligibility. And as we noted, if the matchable amount went from $150 to $100 or to some lower amount, that would actually increase the number of donors that somebody would need to be eligible, which would make that somewhat more challenging. And there was a second.
Participation in,
Oh, yes.
in terms of the
Please, if you
other
could wrap it
cities.
up,
so,
because we're really behind.
In fact, maybe this would be helpful to that end. I believe there's a number of witnesses who are coming, can speak to that.
Yeah.
Numerous municipalities across the state have done that, and the participation rate varies. I'm sure those other witnesses could speak to it in detail.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say, I think they could probably talk about their own programs. Councilwoman Bass, you had a question?
Yes, I do.
Yes. And if I could, Mr. Wolf, you're going to be next. Why don't you sit right up here, because we want to try to keep moving and get these good folks from New York and other places on their way.
Good
Please,
afternoon.
Councilwoman.
Good afternoon.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony and for being here today. And, you know, it's as I've been sitting here listening and just digesting all of the pros and cons in terms of public financing and why that makes sense and why it also could be, you know, a bit of an issue for us. And I was wondering, as a district council person, if you could, you know, hear my concerns and possibly speak to them, which really lend itself to the business that we're in, which is really quite reactive. And so I think as district council members, we spend a lot of time putting out fires, dealing with issues in our districts. You know, on any given day, I could be dealing with mold in a school or trash that's been dumped or, you know, a crime that's happened. And so there's a number of different things that when I ask people, why are they leaving the city or why are they, why do they not live in Philadelphia proper? What those reasons are, and they usually are surrounded around things like education, crime and safety, blight, things like that that we are responding to on a regular basis. But what I don't hear is, you know, that public financing, the system that we have in place, is a part of the reason that makes Philadelphia a less desirable place. And so when we talk about spending money and limited resources, even though it's a very small percentage of the city budget, that's money that I would surely take, and I'm sure that any other district council member would be happy to take and find productive ways to spend, to fix, to address issues in their district. So I'm wondering, how do you balance the needs that we have as district council members in our respective districts? How are we to balance our needs and the needs of our constituents versus this particular policy, which, by the way, I think is, you know, an important issue. I think it's a very productive matter that we should be considering and should have had some conversation about. I think this conversation is long overdue, but I think that the timing of it and the expenditure of funds at this time when everybody's belts are really, really tight, how do we spend funds on this particular initiative when at the same time we've got so many other issues that are pressing, so that every dollar that's spent, every single dollar is allocated for, that it's going into a place that people want to see it spent in. And to be quite honest, I just don't hear from my constituents or from people that I'm trying to get to move into Philadelphia, oh, well, if you had a public financing system, then that makes a difference for me. They talk about crime, they talk about schools, they talk about blight, they talk about trash. Those are the things that are important to them. And even as Councilman O had mentioned earlier, when you talk about what's important, if you narrowed it down to election-related matters, they would say gerrymandering is an issue. Not so much in Philadelphia, but that's one of the issues that I think people are concerned about. So I was wondering if you could speak to that, and I know we're behind time, so I won't go on.
Just try to briefly respond and say that I think it's not surprising that your constituents wouldn't say to you that, you know, this particular policy piece is something that they want to see. They might not have the familiarity even with those types of programs. What I would suggest, and again, I think other witnesses might be able to speak to this even more, is that a common thread in the concerns that you identify that your constituents have is the responsiveness of government to their concerns. And I certainly appreciate, Councilwoman, that they see the responsiveness from you because they're having the conversation with you. And I think that that's very powerful for citizens to see that whether it's elected officials or candidates, are out there having that conversation with them. And so the goal of the main policy goal of this program is that it's pushing candidates out there more often, and that shows people that somebody's listening to me, that their concerns are being heard by numerous people, candidates or whoever, and I believe that the experience in other jurisdictions has been that that does help increase people's confidence in their government and their feeling that it is responsive to them.
I hear what you're saying, but I also know that, as someone who's constantly on the hot seat, that short of, shuffling the deck, changing the players, it may give people confidence, possibly in the system. Maybe it would increase their level of confidence. But at the same time, it doesn't change the amount of resources. The resources that we have are the resources that we have. So does that give a false sense of security that, if I'm changing, from this person to that person, and suddenly is all the blight going to be addressed? Is all the, are all the schools going to get fixed? Are all the, all the things that are important to me, are they going to be addressed because of this person is possibly more responsive? And I just think, that that's something that we have to be careful of, because we don't want to give a false impression that public financing is going to change responsiveness with the same amount of resources. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Just say that certainly, Councilwoman, that balancing the question of resources is for the council to decide that, after hearing the merits of the program and the potential costs of it, if they want to approve this and send it to the ballot initiative. And that's that kind of policy weighing that the members are engaging in now. And I think that as you sort of each side of the scale on that, the information from what the effect and experience of these programs has been in other jurisdictions is very helpful, because with Philadelphia, of course, we're projecting, and so we can't say exactly how it's going to go, but there's a lot of lessons to be drawn from the many, many jurisdictions, or the significant number, I guess, to be not so many, around the country that have used these type of programs and the benefits that they've seen from it.
I'll try to make a few useful comments in brief. I think you put your finger on it, which is ultimately, the question that would be tested at the ballot box in this. Is my concern about schools, crime, opioid, trash on the street, whatever, greater than my concern about the system, the system that represents me here? I was struck with Councilman Green reminding us that this proposal first came up in 2006 when there was a huge amount of concern about the role of money in politics and what had happened and things going off the rail and people were getting contracts and so forth and so on. That's often the case around the country, that a solution like this enters popular acceptance after some scandal. I think that was true in New York. There is, I think, a great deal of anger and frustration out there, now whether it's localized in Philadelphia, out there about what's happening in our democracy and our government. I think there is a lot of concern about, it's broken, it's rigged, no one listens to me, so forth and so on. Again, I'm not suggesting that's localized in Philadelphia or in your district, but to the extent that is a concern of ours and a concern of mine. Both of you pointed out, the gerrymandering issue, which is one aspect of that, but I think if that concern's out there, this is clearly one viable and important response to alleviating some of those frustrations.
Okay, all right. Okay, all right, thank you. Any other? Okay, thank you. Thank you both. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Mr. Wolf, why don't you come up? Folks, we're getting to you, I promise. Before dinner time, how about that? I promise that. So, but again, I ask everyone, please, to try to be as brief as possible with your remarks, because we're obviously running very late. And I understand we have a New York council person on the phone patiently waiting also. Mr. Wolf, please identify yourself for the record and proceed.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ross Wolf. I am a Republican ward leader here in Philadelphia. I'm also the chairman of the Philadelphia Young Republicans. I'd like to start out by thanking Chairman Greenlee and Vice Chairman Green for having me here today, as well as the entire committee. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak on this important policy matter. I know we're running late. I'm going to try to keep this brief. I submitted written testimony, so I'm going to kind of run through 5 points that I think are very important with this bill. The first point is I don't think it is government's role to be funding elections. That should be done by candidates. That should be done by people who support the candidates. Government shouldn't inject themselves. But especially when we have so many other financial responsibilities that we can't fully fund right now. So the Philadelphia Young Republicans recently donated over 300 backpacks to 11 different public schools in Philadelphia, in North, South, West, and Northeast. And I can tell you, if you have a few $1 million to throw around, those schools can use them. Because we also went into a couple charter schools, and the resources there compared to the resources in the public schools were astounding. My point number 2, I think that the effect of this bill will be to help connected and insider Democrats and will hurt Republicans, independents, or third-party candidates, and outsider Democrats. When you look at the minimums that are required to qualify for this funding, $50,000 for mayor, $15,000 for other offices. It's not going to be easy for any outsider, Republican, or third-party candidate to hit those limits, especially if you look at the mayoral limits. If you look at Melissa Murray Bailey last cycle, I think she raised under $30,000. Look at Doug Oliver, under $30,000. Now you're asking them to raise $50,000 in increments of 150 or less. Third point, I think independent PACs are going to be strengthened here. I think that people will give that $150, but if they want to give $500, $600, $700, they're going to. They're just going to give it to an independent PAC so they don't blow the public contribution part of it. Fourth point, potential misuse of the funds. As many of you know, if after the election there's public funds left over, it has to be returned to the city. I strongly believe that no politician will let a dime go back to the city. They will ensure that every bit of it spent, they will use it on unnecessary things. My concern would be that people who would get bonuses, would get paid more money than they otherwise would, or get paid money for doing things that would otherwise be volunteer work. I also think that you could have a serious problem of candidates going to friends and saying, hey, give me $150 now. You work for a few hours on my campaign, I'll give you $500 back later. They still gain a net benefit under that. The fifth issue I see with it is the fraud provision. The fraud provision states that if you submit false or misleading or fraudulent information in connection with an application for these funds, you are subject to up to a $2,000 fine. It's basically an ethics board violation. And in every other context, if you lie or give false information intentionally to get money from the government, that's a crime. I can't think of another instance where it's not. And I understand that there are many campaign finance rules that if you break, they are not criminal offenses. But there are no campaign finance laws where the city is giving candidates money. I think that is a big distinction. I think that if you intentionally lie to the government to get money, that is fraud, and you should be subject to criminal penalties just like everyone else in every other context. That sums up my testimony, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Before I recognize Councilwoman Gibb, just for the record, I guess I'm as about an inside Democrat as there is, and as I said, I have a problem with some issues with this bill. So I write the opinion, I'm not sure I agree with you on that one point, but I'll leave that as it goes. Councilwoman Gibb?
Yes, thank you very much, Councilman Greenlee, Chairman. I just had one side point, and respect that, your testimony and all, but I think it is important to understand that government does actually do have a role around elections. We have an entire Board of Ethics that we support very strongly. We establish campaign finance reform. All of that has an incredible impact on political elections. And so while I understand that there may be disagreements with the bill and your own perspective, I think it's important to establish that government has traditionally had a role around it, and this bill has a lot to do with strengthening and, hopefully getting people who are not used to some of these campaign finance laws to come closer in and have more direct contact with the Board of Ethics. That's actually one of the benefits of the bill, that anyone who runs on a publicly financed slate would begin talking with Board of Ethics immediately about their responsibilities, what are the terms of the publicly financed slate, what are the responsibilities around it and reporting on it. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that nobody's going to, go around it. But one of the things that we've been working hard on is helping people understand campaign finance laws a lot better. Being on a publicly financed slate will certainly get them in touch. It will be more difficult, I think, to game the system. They don't get anything that much out of it. No one's getting rich off of $150 contributions, and people don't actually have to reach the limits. It's up to those limits amounts. So, but among those things, I understand that your statement, but it is really important that we do have a role around this.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Cal. Any other questions? No? Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. Ms. Marconi, our next panel, please.
Brad Lander and Amy Loprest.
And I understand Councilperson Lander is on the phone, is that correct?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Okay. Pretty much, can you hear? Yeah, okay, so far we can hear, yes. Thank you. Ms. Loprest, if you could, whoever wants to go first?
I'll let the council member go first since he's been waiting.
Okay, yeah. So, first of all, Councilman, sorry to have you waiting that long, but, you've probably gone through a few hearings too, so. Please identify yourself and proceed.
Absolutely, and I know it's not easy to listen on the phone, so I'll try to be brief. Let me just make sure you can hear me okay.
Just about.
You know what? Let me call right back in from my landline. I just got back into my office. I will call right back from my landline.
All right, sure thing.
All right.
Who answers the phone? The wonders of technology. Yes.
Hi, this is Councilmember Lander.
That sounds better. Okay, go ahead,
All right.
sir.
And actually, since she's there in person, Amy, why don't you go first, and I'll follow you so they can understand the New York program from someone who's in the room.
Okay.
Please identify yourself and proceed.
Good afternoon. I'm Amy Loprest, the Executive Director of the New York City Campaign Finance Board. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I have submitted my written testimony, so I will just give some highlights. As has been mentioned earlier today, the New York City's program was started in 1988 in response to a series of corruption scandals, and it has been strengthened over the 26 years by the board and in partnership with our partners in city government, the mayor and the city council. I just want to give a framework of what the scope of the New York City program. It is a nonpartisan rather than a bipartisan 5-member board that oversees the program. It covers 59 offices in New York City, 3 that are citywide, mayor, public advocate, and controller, 5 borough presidents, and 51 city council members. All candidates who run for office in New York City are subject to contribution limits and prohibitions and extensive disclosure requirements. As far as the public matching funds program, the city matches the first $175 of contributions from New York City residents at a rate of $6 to $1. So a $25 contribution is worth $175 to a candidate. In order to qualify for those funds, candidates must meet a 2-part threshold to demonstrate support. They must agree to abide by spending limits. They must be on the ballot. The 2-part threshold, for example, for New York City Council member is you must raise 75 matchable contributions from people in your district and a total of $5,000 in matchable contributions. Public funds are capped at 55% of the spending limit. So for example, in 2017, the election that's going on right now, Candidates for city council can spend up to $182,000 for the primary, and another $182,000 for the general election, and are entitled to qualify for up to $100,100 in public matching funds. So just talking a little bit about the results of the program in New York City, and I'm sure Councilmember Lander will have some additional comments on this. In 2017, 83% of the primary candidates participated in the program, and 65% of the general election candidates are participating in the program. In 2017, 86% of all funds raised by city candidates are raised by individuals, as opposed to only 14% from PACs, unions, and other sources. To compare that to the state elections in New York State, in 2012, about 2/3 of their money came from these outside PACs, corporations, unions. In 2013, 2/3 of the contributors gave $175 or less. And in the last 3 election cycles, more than half of the contributors from New York City were people who gave for the very first time to a political candidate. We have done some independent research with the City University of New York and have discovered that people who contribute to candidates are 3 times more likely to vote in that election, so there is a civic benefit in addition to all the other benefits. And just to give you some facts, in all of the citywide elections that have occurred in New York City to date, the city has paid out about $175 million in public matching funds. In the 2017 election, which is going on, and the final public funds payments have not been made because the election has not occurred yet, we've paid out $15.8 million to 102 candidates in 2017. Our largest payout in public funds was the elections in 2001, where we paid out $42 million to 205 candidates.
All right, thank you. Before we have questions, Councilman Lander, why don't you give whatever statement you have, and then I know some of the members have questions.
Great. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be there with you today by phone, and I'd be happy to come down at some point and talk with you in person. I'm a big admirer of many things that have happened in the Philadelphia City Council, so thank you for your service and for this opportunity.
Maybe you want to see our football team
I
sometime,
really
too.
believe that the New York City campaign finance system is an extraordinary vehicle for strengthening our local democracy in New York City. And while obviously there's an expenditure involved and money is scarce, to me it seems that expanding participation and building confidence and preventing corruption is really a priceless expenditure for a city government. So I wholeheartedly support it here. We have work to keep improving it, and of course the details are important, but I would really urge you to do it. It's made a big difference in our service. First, it enables people to run who simply would not otherwise. I know the previous speakers spoke to the issue about it worrying that it would support regular candidates or incumbents. It puts people on a level playing field. If you look at that map about where people contribute to council candidates, small dollar donors, and where people contribute in New York City to our state elected officials, it's just night and day. You get your constituents in small dollar amounts contributing, and that not only changes who participates in the elections, it changes who can run. So my colleague Richie Torres in the Bronx, my colleague Carlos Menchaca in a mostly Puerto Rican and Mexican neighborhood in Sunset Park, a wonderful candidate from Brownsville, Brooklyn, one of the lowest income neighborhoods in the city, Alika Ampry Samuel. They'll all tell you they could not have run if it were not for our matching program and the ability to raise money in neighborhoods that people are not traditional campaign donors. Second, it really substantially increases people's faith in government. One great feature of our system is that the contributions from people who are doing business with the city, developers or contractors with the city, aren't matched. They can still give, but at lower amounts and without matching funds. Now, that was something that got added to our system. It was not there on day one. But we realized at one point that about 1/3 of the contributions to city council members were coming from real estate developers and people who were doing business with the city. And that, for understandable reasons, was undermining confidence in the New York City Council. So now, with that law changed, less than 5% of contributions to New York City Council members come from real estate developers or contractors or people who do business with the city. That's good for our decision making, and it is great for talking to people about how we're being straightforward and honest and transparent. It has made a big difference in how we can consider land use issues when people know that there's a legal restriction on those contributions, and I've really felt the difference. Third, I would say it's fantastic to have spending limits, and that's good for everyone. I mean, I know you guys, you have to do this too. Just the amount of time that elected officials in races without spending limits have to spend fundraising is not good for our public service or our lives. And having spending limits means you know how much you have to raise, you go raise that amount, and then you're going to be on a level playing field with the other candidates in the race, and you just don't wind up with an unlimited arms war or having to raise and raise and raise to the detraction of your ability to serve our communities. I have a district like the district council members there. It makes a real big difference. Two very quick points on super PACs. First, the New York program releases the spending limit for candidates where not super PACs, for if you have a large, if someone doesn't participate in the program or they self-finance and spend very large amounts of money outside the program, in our program your spending cap is lifted. That doesn't give you the money to compete with them easily, but you can continue to raise. And we have a great law that we passed this term for super PACs and independent expenditures that requires the listing of the 3 top donors to the super PAC on the mail or in the TV or radio ad, which has done a lot to force transparency and I think has really made a big difference this term. And my final point, I will add, our program has 3 tiers, and it might be something you would want to consider there. We have the district council members, we have citywide elected officials, and in between, we have these borough presidents. I know you have citywide at-large council members and some other offices like that. You might want to look at that feature of our system and add a tier in between the district council members and the mayor as a way, as a practical implication. But I'll stop there. I'm glad to answer questions. As you can hear, I'm really enthusiastic about this system. It's a lot to do, and of course it costs money, but at least here, it has substantially strengthened New York City's government and local democracy.
Okay, thank you, sir. I just had one question. I know the other members do. Ms. Lopez, you probably may answer this better. Do you have any numbers on the percentage of citizens or percentage of registered voters, however you have it, that do participate, that do contribute to this?
Well, I mean, New York City is a huge, huge city. I don't have the exact percentage, but we do. I mean, most of the money raised by candidates is raised from people. So, and you know, we've always, in every election cycle, because of the small dollar match, have increased the number of people who give as a first time. So, of course, many people give, you know, in every election, but every year, every election we have, we increase the number of people who are first-time participants as contributors.
Now, the reason I ask, I'm just wondering how, you know, just because one of the concerns, and I admit, as I said earlier, I have one of my concerns is that, you know, yeah, there's a public that does participate in this program, but there may be a large amount that chooses not to, but their tax money is still going into the program. That's the reason. I'm just trying to get a feel for how many, you know, just
but of
the
course,
percentage of citizens that participate.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
That's
But of course, all the citizens benefit from having more inclusive elections, also having more competition in elections, and also having elected officials who are more responsive to, you know, their constituents rather than big moneyed interests.
Okay. All right. Just on move on. Just on the issue of involvement in people running, I think we said earlier that it seems like we have people that run here in Philadelphia. It hasn't seemed to discourage people from running for office that I could, that we could see. And I think even Mr. Thornburg said that it didn't look like this program really necessarily pushed more people to run for office. Maybe you found differently in New York, but again, you do have term limits, which probably play into that too, correct?
Yeah, and as Mr. Thornburg points out, it's hard to parse the effects of the program and the effects of the term limits. The first year that term limits were in effect, the first year that people were term limited out of office was 2001, and that was the first year that we had our multiple match program at 4-to-1. So we had a huge number of people participating in the program, 353 candidates in that year. So it's, again, hard to parse the effects, but.
And like you say, you're a big place up there, so. All right, thank you for those answers. Councilman Green?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Councilman Lander and Ms. Loprest. Just have a few quick questions. What percentage of your city budget is spent on public financing of campaigns?
It is a fraction. Our budget is about,
52.
this year was 56.6 million, which includes the public funds and the funds to print the voter guide. And the city's budget, correct me if I'm wrong, Councilmember Lander, is I think $89 billion.
$89 billion.
That's right.
Right.
So it is a tiny fraction.
And definitely seemed like there was an increase in the number of candidates as a result of the public financing campaigns. But earlier in testimony, and both the Councilman Lander as well as Ms. Loprest, you both can answer this. You said people were 3 times more likely to vote. And how did you come up with that number?
We did a research study with the CUNY Graduate Center in the 2013 election to test exactly this proposition. So they, with their research methodology, they matched people who were voting, because you're voting, whether you voted is public, not who you voted for, and with the contribution records that we have from disclosure.
And then just based on your sentiment, what's been the general mood of the public in using city dollars for campaigns?
I think that most people are happy that we do this. Again, we struggle, like most jurisdictions in the U.S., in voter turnout. It is a struggle that voter apathy and encouraging people. When they hear about this program and they hear about what we do, we did a focus group test of people to find out what they felt about it, and they thought that this would, because the way it deals with corruption or the potential for corruption, really improve their desire to vote. That focus group was done with people who are traditional drop-off voters, people who vote in presidential elections but then don't vote in municipal elections.
I'll just add, voters want candidates to participate in the program. When voters ask candidates, they know it's out there. Obviously, if you don't have anyone running against you, you don't get the matching funds. But in competitive elections, voters ask, "Are you participating?" And they want the candidates to be participating because they think it makes a fair and level playing field that's more free from corruption. I can't say I've never had someone say, "Oh, is that the best use of our money?" But for every person that's questioned whether it's a good expenditure of tax dollars, there's 20 people that have said, "Are you participating in the program? I want a strong campaign finance system in the city."
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councilman. Councilwoman Kim.
Yes, thank you very much. To Councilmember Lander, this is Helen Gim. Thank you so much for your comments, Harry, and your enthusiasm. And in particular, I think it helps that as a citywide council candidate, it does help to hear that the tiered system works or has been enacted in New York City. So thanks, Brad. And then I guess my other question that I have a little bit to Ms. Loprest, one of the things that I've been very interested in has been, because I am just the most recent, or one of the more recent people coming into Philadelphia City Council. When I certainly ran for City Council, it was a little overwhelming with the campaign finance responsibilities regulations. Everybody's afraid of making a mistake. Do you feel like when people enter into the public finance system, how often are they in touch with you? Are they more in touch with you, for example, than people who do not participate in the system? Some people have raised concerns about problems that arise within the system. Do you feel like candidates who participate in publicly financed elections tend to have a better track record around, hewing close to their responsibilities according to the law?
Well, let me answer that in a couple of different ways. And first, one thing that we do in our office is we do a lot of training and outreach and provide a lot of assistance to candidates. One thing we did for the first time in 2017 was create a special training that was new to the campaign finance world. And we had a lot of people take that training, people who wound up not running, people who were already saying that they were running for a different office because they just wanted some information about what it means to run for office. All the candidates and a candidate or a treasurer are mandated by law to attend our compliance and training about our software, CSmart, which is what they use to file their disclosure statements. We also have candidate services liaisons who are available to answer all questions. As far as compliance, one thing is that obviously in order to receive the public financing, you need to be in compliance with the law, in the disclosure requirements, the contribution requirements. So the people who receive public financing are more in compliance with law. We do a rigorous audit process before, during, and after the election to ensure that the money that is paid in public funds is paid on valid contributions, and we do a post-election audit to ensure that the money that is paid is actually spent on campaign funds. I think my previous person who testified talked about the money coming back after the election. We've definitely, candidates do have money left over after the election. They do return it to the city's coffers. We have pretty strict rules about what you can spend money on post-election, and our audit enforces those. I'll let Councilmember Lander, nobody likes to be audited. We do a lot, we try very hard to help candidates organize their finances, organize their records, so that they're prepared for that audit process.
And
let me just add here, it is really important to set up a good institution that can do both sides here, because obviously it's meaningless unless you've got enforcement, because occasionally there will be someone who tries to cheat, and it's critical to have the enforcement. But it also needs to make it as easy as possible for people to comply, with a system that is looking at how you're raising and spending your money. I think the New York City Campaign Finance Board has done a really good job, and I say that as someone who contested a finding in my first campaign. They had a finding. I brought it before the board. I appealed it. We went through that process, and I come out feeling like it's a fair system, it's a rigorous system, and it is a system that tries to help you comply, and it's important to set that up as part of the process.
Yeah, and I think that that's one major appeal of publicly financed elections, is that it does help all of our candidates get in closer touch with our Board of Ethics, with the Campaign Finance Board, become more familiar. And being on a publicly financed slate does mean you're hewing close to or adhering completely to the laws that govern the publicly financed slate. And so that's an enormous appeal, I think, both as folks who care a lot about the integrity of the process as well as the integrity of the people that they're voting for. And for myself personally, as somebody who had a lot of low dollar donations in the race, it does matter for folks to hear who are first-time donors that their contributions matter as much as somebody who is giving at multiples at that. And so very inspiring from New York. Thank you very much, as always.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Councilman Councilman O.
Thank you very much. So thank you. You were here when I stated my concerns about campaign finance, public financing. I do have them. And may I ask you, the Campaign Finance Board, who appoints the board?
It's a 5-member nonpartisan board, so 2 members are appointed by the mayor, 2 members are appointed by the Speaker of the City Council. Those 2 members, the mayor's 2 members and the speaker's 2 members, cannot be of the same political party. And the chair of the board is selected by the mayor after consultation with the Speaker of the City Council.
So those terms are staggered, and up till now, neither the mayor nor the speaker have appointed all 5 members. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, because the terms are 5 years,
Right.
and the one comes up every year.
But they will soon have appointed all 5 members of the Campaign Finance Board. Coming up soon.
Because there are a lot of people who've been appointed, there are several members who have been long-term members, so they
Right.
were initially appointed by a different mayor or speaker, or maybe reappointed by the current one.
Yes.
So I'd have to parse that in my brain to actually answer that accurately.
So what happened with John Liu in his mayoral run? My understanding is that the Campaign Finance Board cited the fact that they had concerns about his campaign fundraising and therefore did not release matching funds to him, despite him not being convicted or found in any way to be connected with any wrongdoing, and therefore, without the campaign finance, he was not able to run for mayor, and therefore, people will say that Mayor de Blasio sailed to victory without competition from another Democrat.
Well, there's a couple things there. That case was probably one of the most unique cases before the board. In that case, a campaign's treasurer had been convicted of crimes related to the campaign financing before the election actually occurred. The candidates and the treasurers are all liable for the conduct of their campaign. The board did its own investigation of the potential straw donor scheme in that case and made a determination that Mr. Liu is not entitled to receive public matching funds because he was not in compliance with the law. That was part of my answer to the previous question, was that you have to be in compliance. As far as the second part of your question, there were, I think, 7 Democratic candidates on the primary ballot in 2013. I may have the number wrong. It might have been 6, but there certainly was rigorous competition in the Democratic primary in 2013.
Yeah, I would say not as popular as John Liu. He was a very popular elected official, well-known, and many people were looking forward to his race on the merits, but he could not get into the race. So I'm not trying to...
Let me chime in here with 2
Sure.
things. I mean, I do think it's worth noting that there were convictions in a court of law, that is of a higher level of a higher standard than the Campaign Finance Board had said of his campaign, and certainly, Christine Quinn and Bill Thompson, and at the beginning of the campaign anyway, Anthony Weiner had an awful lot of popular support as well. So there was a rigorous primary, thanks in large part to campaign financing.
Yes, thank you, Councilman. This is Councilman David O. And listen, I don't disagree with that. However, the fact is that a very popular citywide elected official was unable to run. And my question is, because that is my concern, that the Campaign Finance Board, rather than letting him run, until such time as there was some either conviction of him or a court decided by a preponderance of the evidence using the standard, rules of evidence that, I think are very, very important to our judicial process, but they don't apply to the Campaign Board of Finance. The Campaign Board of Finance has its own standards and can determine that it will not release funds as it did For example, after 9/11, it decided to push back the primary date by 2 weeks. And while that may be a good decision, I don't know. I just don't know that it is the role of the Campaign Finance Board to decide that because of 9/11 tragedy, that none of the candidates can campaign on what had just happened, just a tremendous tragedy, a big problem. And so some candidate might have wanted to get out there and may have been able to change the dynamic of the race, but the Campaign Finance Board denied any distribution of funds to any candidates and basically said, in addition to pushing the date back 2 weeks, also said that no candidate is allowed to campaign, which I find a little unusual.
Okay, so let me answer that question, because I think there's a, first, in the John Liu case, there had been, as I said, it's a unique case because there had been convictions in a court of law prior to the board's determination to not pay Mr. Liu. And and so just to clarify, while the board withheld his funds, he was on the ballot and was able to run and received a percentage of the votes. So I'm not denying that the public funds are important, but we did not say that he could not run for office.
But he didn't have any money. He didn't have the money to run. He didn't have the money to run.
I don't think you would want the city to provide matching funds to someone who was committing fraud on the system.
I don't know that he was committing fraud. In other words, that was not determined in a court of law. I wasn't in the election. All I'm saying is, my concern is that, is he the only person that ever had a similar situation? No other candidate or incumbent or anyone who ran for office never had a similar situation in the history of New York?
Well, no candidate had ever had their treasurer convicted of crimes related to their campaign financing before. That is true. Certainly, there have been other, this is an unfortunate, but this is event, but of course it's why you have rigorous enforcement, certainly there have been other candidates who have engaged in nominee contribution attempts to submit nominee contributions to receive public matching funds and have not received public matching funds. Some of them have been prosecuted in court. After the election. Also, Mr. Liu had the opportunity to afford himself to challenge the board's decision in court, and he did avail himself of that opportunity after the election. So as far as the 2001, I think that this is always gets conflated. Unfortunately, the tragedy of September 11th, 2001 occurred on New York City's primary day. So many primary locations, polling sites were disrupted because of the tragedy. Obviously, the city was in a fair amount of chaos, and the state decided to push the date of the election. The Campaign Finance Board had nothing to do with that decision, decided to rerun the primary entirely. What the position was that the Campaign Finance Board was in at the time was that since it was primary day and there are primary spending limits, candidates reasonably had budgeted their entire budget for the spending limit up to the date of the primary. When the state moved the date of the primary, the board was not allowed by law, but this law has actually since been changed in response to this, which is part of the dynamic nature of our system, did not have the authority to increase the spending limit. It was not allowable by law. So what the board's decision was to allow candidates to recreate their spending for the primary day operations, so as not to advantage candidates who had not spent up to the spending limit before the primary, as compared to people who had, well within their rights, budgeted and spent up to the primary spending limit up to primary day. And that decision was supported by the major mayoral candidates at the time, most of whom felt that they were not going to be campaigning anyway because of the nature of the tragedy that had just occurred.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilwoman Sanchez?
Thank you so much, and I'll be brief because I know we have other people to testify. I want to thank you. I want to thank Councilman Greenlee for allowing us to have this discussion. It's never a right time to talk about priorities and money. If you listen to Philly Mag, I'm the establishment's worst nightmare, so you could see we go from all extremes here.
I never considered you a nightmare, Councilman, just for the record.
A headache sometimes, maybe not the nightmare. I am concerned around, setting standards and expectations for folks. Last time I ran, I had somebody over the course of 5 days raise $150,000 from different sources, and in an election, and anything that gets people to believe the system is clearer and more transparent is definitely a conversation worth having. And I really just wanted to echo that this is not about money, because the budget connotation is low. It's really around creating the political space to have a conversation and to explore what New York has done and others, and how that increases participation. Just this weekend, I was hosting an election training for folks in the neighborhood, and they're just tired of all of the fraud and campaign stuff in districts like mine, particularly the Latino community. And you just heard people's frustration, particularly election board people who are really innocent in all of this. So kudos to New York, and again, I'm happy that we can have that discussion, just like the Board of Ethics. We should be okay with feeling uncomfortable with some components of this and talking about it, and ultimately, hopefully, giving the voters an opportunity to make a decision. So thank you for sharing it. I'm sure we're going to have more conversations, because this is not
Thank
by
you.
any means done deal.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Councilwoman. If there's no other questions, Ms. Lopez and Councilman Lander, thank you both for your participation. And,
Thanks so much and good luck.
Okay, thank you. Again, sorry to hold you that long.
Not at all. My pleasure.
Okay, thank you, sir. Okay. Ms. Marconi, I think we had 2 more panels. They're still hanging in there with us.
Ian Vander Walker and Katie Kelly.
They here? Okay. I take it you're Miss Kelly, right? You heard my spiel before. I think we have your testimony, so if you could summarize, we'd appreciate it, and available for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Greenlee and members of the committee. Yes, you do have my testimony, so I will go through Yes, I'll go through the highlights very quickly. We appreciate the opportunity to testify today in support of the matching funds public financing legislation. The Campaign Legal Center has carefully reviewed the bill, and we believe it is a well-crafted constitutional piece of legislation. If enacted, the bill would establish the public financing system for the city of Philadelphia and propel the city into the national forefront in this area. We believe that the multi-million-dollar contributions from individuals to super PACs and other political entities have left many Americans feeling excluded from the democratic process. Public financing offers an alternative. Public funding can elevate the voices of all citizens in the political process, not just those who can afford to write extremely large checks. Although there are many important and effective reforms the council might wish to consider, the Campaign Legal Center believes public financing is a particularly promising option. Public funding programs can reorient our elections by facilitating dialogue between voters and our elected officials and increase participation in the electoral process. My testimony also goes more into detail in terms of the constitutionality of public financing programs and offers a couple suggestions for the bill. The other panels have touched on what I would characterize as systemic problems we're facing with our democracy at this time. We have seen poll after poll and serious questions from the electorate reflecting a loss of faith in the system, a loss of faith in our democratic institutions, and a feeling that the system is designed to minimize their voice and minimize their vote. Gerrymandering is part of it, dark money is part of it, and a feeling that that individuals' votes and voices are being drowned out by big money is also part of it. I wish I could offer you some silver bullet that would cover all of these things. There just isn't one. Instead, I think that you have to take it bit by bit and address each of those problems in turn. And
we're facing a very complicated system that unfortunately can't be covered by one piece of legislation. But I think that this bill is an important step to begin to restore some faith in our democratic institutions and engage more voters and more citizens in the process. And with that, I'll look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you. Any question? Councilman Green?
Just briefly, so you've had a chance to hear a lot of the testimony, and I'm curious your perspective on removing either changing the matching amount to a lower threshold or removing the mayoral election from public financing campaigns. If you have any opinion on that based on what you've heard today.
Well, I think in terms of budgeting consideration, we've seen other systems, like Seattle, for example. They have started their voucher program this election cycle just covering a couple of council seats to see how it goes, give the body that's administering the program a chance to figure it out, see what they need to do, and also a chance to educate the electorate in what's going on. And that's been a successful system, under this first election cycle, and it also gives the city a chance to build some revenue to eventually expand the program and cover the mayoral races as well. So I think that there could be some advantages in terms of the city adjusting to this new program and building up a revenue source to pay for it to phase in the implementation.
And in those jurisdictions that have public financing campaigns, do they have a calendar year process or a calendar or a campaign cycle process in reference to?
I would have to look. It varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, so it depends. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There are no other questions? We're getting tired here, sorry. Thank you.
Understandable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I assume who Representative from Brennan Center for Justice have left? Is that right?
Yeah,
They're
he
not here.
wasn't
Okay.
able to make it today.
So their written testimony will be made part of the record, as will Michael Malbin of the Campaign Finance Institute. His written testimony will also be made part of the record. Ms. Marconi, I believe we have one more panel.
Susan Motet and Paul Ryan.
Is there anyone else here other than these two individuals that wish to testify? Great, thank you. Okay. No, that's good, that's good. I won't repeat my spiel, but we have your written testimony.
Yes. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I will summarize my written
thank you.
testimony. I am Susan Mattei. I'm from Every Voice, a national organization that is dedicated to designing, passing, and supporting implementation of small donor-funded election reform. My testimony goes into one of the reasons to pass a small donor public financing program from the voters' perspective, which is that voters have lost confidence at all levels of government, that their elected leaders are working for the benefit of everyone because of the perception and sometimes the reality that money is corrupting our politics. A poll in 2016 showed money in politics being 3 of the 4 top concerns in the election, with the economy only being one of those 4 concerns. Another graph in my testimony shows that over 90% of voters now think that the government works in the interest of a few big donors, and less than 10% think that the government works for the benefit of all. And we see this concern at the federal, state, and local level in our polling. We also see in another poll that 65% of people believe that money in politics, the impact of money in politics affects them or their families. It's not abstract. Voters blame elected officials for this. 70% of them blame politicians for the influence of money in politics, and much fewer than that blame the special interests or wealthy donors for the problem of money in politics. And I would like to note that because elected officials very rarely talk about their own frustration with the campaign finance system, voters assume that elected officials think it's great. And our polling and focus group shows that voters actually prefer candidates and elected officials that talk about the problem of money in politics and pass solutions to reduce its influence. However, I do want to note that
while voters are very aware of the problem of money in politics, they're less aware that there are solutions to it. So that's why you don't hear people saying, hey, we want public financing. They know that there's a problem and they think there might not be a solution. But then when you actually poll them and say, hey, how about if there's a system that matches small contributions so that candidates raise money from ordinary people instead of big donors, they love it. And we see that 76% of independent voters support it, 74% of Democrats, and 66% of Republicans do. So that's why it's important to pass solutions to this problem of big money distorting our democracy. I'd also like to note that it is a good policy because it has been passed in 32 jurisdictions at some level. We actually know how it works. So, and that helps bring a reality check to a lot of the speculation, some of which we heard today. Like, this will empower PACs as opposed to reducing their influence, or just any kind of speculation. Organizations like Every Voice and like some of the organizations testifying in person or written today really carefully study these programs. Are they meeting the intended outcomes? Are they not having any unintended consequences? And so they do look at, well, how did the campaign spending compare to independent expenditures before the system, after the system? I actually wish I had some of that data with me today, and I don't. But our research director has it. If anyone's interested, we're happy to share it. I mentioned in my written testimony that these programs can reduce the barriers to elected office and can result in elected leaders that are more reflective of their constituents. It's by race, but it's not just by race. It also increases gender diversity and income diversity. And that's something that's rarely studied, but when people do look at it, they usually do find that elected leaders' incomes prior to office is usually more than the median income of the people they represent. And one person, Tish James, the first African-American woman to win citywide office in New York, credits the matching program with her ability to win, partly because she doesn't have family members who could give large contributions. She doesn't have a network of people who could give large contributions because she's not really strongly from people of means. The other thing that has been mentioned a number of times is that it broadens and diversifies participation by donors. And I just wanted to, I wanted to echo that, but also just kind of draw attention to the graph on the top of page 5 of my testimony, because, I think it's important to note where the line is, where donors start skewing more affluent, more male, and more white. And it's lower than people think. Below $25, and donors are actually more racially diverse than the city in New York. Around 25, they're about even. And then above 25, it starts pretty steeply skewing to more white. And it really flatlines at $250. So, and then, similarly, there's another graph that shows that actually at no income level, or at no donor level, are donors showing the economic diversity of New York, but the lower the donation level, the closer it is to sort of the average New York income. And I have some other charts from other jurisdictions in there as well. But what it really shows is that the more a system really amplifies those $25 donors, or maybe up to $50 donors, but it tries to not amplify much beyond that unless they have to, the better the program actually really diversifies the donor base by race, by income, by all the measures. And on page 7 of my testimony, there's a graph of New York City, and it actually shows that the top of the graph, the map shows New York City and contributions to state legislative races where they don't have a matching program, and the donations are really being drawn from about 30% of neighborhoods. And then it's the same map, except it's donors to New York City races, and where they do have a matching program, and donations are being drawn from 90% of neighborhoods. So it really shows that a program just like the one you guys are contemplating today very successfully and dramatically broadens and diversifies the donor base. I also like to show this to elected officials when they're fretting that, like, can I really broaden my donor base? Will small donors open up their wallets and give? And I show them this to say, yes, they do. When they actually believe their donation matters and it gets matched and you guys actually ask them, they do give. So I just wanted to note that Every Voice also believes that this policy is a strong one. The 5-to-1 match rate is a good starting point. We also analyze the figures in the program to make sure that they're in alignment with the cost of winning elections for each type of race, and that they're in alignment with the existing donor bases of candidates. And then we kind of scale it to what we see in other jurisdictions under these programs. And almost all of the numbers in this proposal are in very nice alignment with the realities of winning elections in Philadelphia. But we do have 2 spots where we think you guys might consider adjusting the program. One has been mentioned before. The matchable amount appears to be unnecessarily high. The graph on the top of page 9 shows that without even increasing donor bases, council candidates can hit their match cap if they're matched only to $50. They're actually blowing way past their match cap if they're matched all the way up to $150 on their current donor base. And then on the next page, we do the same calculation, but we double the donor base because that's the number Every Voice uses to estimate the increase in the donor base when candidates spend the same amount of time fundraising, but focus it on small donors, and they're using under a small donor matching program, they pretty easily double their donor base. And we actually think that, even if the program only matched up to $25, candidates will for council will most likely be able to hit their match cap when matched 5-to-1 if they double their donor base. So we're not saying for sure it should be $25 or $50. There's a lot of judgment that needs to be made. Is this, you want to kind of, on the one hand, balance trying to amplify the smallest contributions. On the other hand, you want to make sure the program's generous enough that candidates who participate can raise enough to compete. So we just wanted to point out that there's some wiggle room to lower that amount. And it will also save the city money. And then the second piece to consider is just...
If I could ask you...
Oh, sure,
wrap up,
yes.
please.
The second piece is just, we think that the council spending cap and match caps are just a little bit low when you look at what a number of council candidates spend. And we recommend raising those up a little bit. And that would cost the city a little bit of money, but there are ways to offset that we're happy to talk to you about. And then I'll skip my section about the cost of the program. And I did want to address one thing that someone had asked, and the witness didn't have an answer to. Someone had asked what the increase of candidate participation is under these programs. And what we have found in other jurisdictions is that it varies between no increase in the number of candidates running to about an 8% increase. And even though the increase in the number of candidates who run is quite modest, this program still successfully enable different types of candidates to run than before.
Okay.
Thank you for letting me
Thank you.
have the opportunity to
Thank you.
testify.
Please identify yourself and proceed.
Good afternoon.
Again,
My name is...
You're from Common Cause, right?
I am with
So we
Common
have your written
Cause.
testimony,
Yes,
so,
sorry. As you can tell, I'm not Paul Ryan.
I didn't think you were. Yeah.
Marilyn Carpintero. I'm the Director for State Operations. I'm speaking on behalf of my colleague, Paul Seamus Ryan.
Okay.
So Common Cause, just briefly, is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that really works to ensure that we create an open and accountable government. We have over 1 million members across the country in all 50 states, and 5,000 specifically just in the city of Philadelphia. I'll be brief, but Common Cause strongly supports the proposed ordinance and looks forward to talking with members of the committee and also to our constituents in this city to talk about it, the benefits, and do some widespread public education of the program. I just want to touch on 2 things quickly. It's clear that the public financing program that's proposed today follows models in other states. As my colleague Susan Mattei at Every Voice has said, there's
over 30 jurisdictions that have it, 12 major cities across the country have it, and 2 of them, New York and Los Angeles, for over 30 years. So there are systems that have been in place long-term that we can learn from. But I want to just touch briefly on, I think, what some of the council members have touched on is ensuring that we have viable, that candidates that are running are candidates, right? They're just not coming, that they are running serious campaigns. And we think that the thresholds and the criteria that are placed on candidates are strong. They are also difficult. And running for public office and gaining access to public funds shouldn't be easy. So we do think that, a mayor running for office would need to get at least 333 donations to total the minimum threshold. So again, the numbers are setting these requirements make sense. And I know some of my colleagues have proposed some changes, and we'd be happy to look at them. But I do think that the city council, when you're setting these thresholds and setting the criteria, you're setting them in a way that makes for candidates to run serious campaigns. But not only that it requires them to ensure that they have the right messaging, that they have that they're talking to candidates, and it's an onus on them to essentially sell themselves to the constituents in that district that they seek to represent. I do just want to highlight another key provision in the ordinance, is the requiring the Board of Elections to provide regular reports to the mayor and council regarding the efficiency, administration, the impact. As you well know, campaign finance is constantly evolving, and with any program, they require regular review and changes to keep it relevant and responsive. Even the best public financing systems like New York goes under regular review after every election. They hold public hearings. They have the campaign people. They have the candidates themselves, and the public at large weighing in. So the city is invested in the system, and together they work with the Campaign Finance Board to make the recommendations and to strengthen their program. So I just wanted to emphasize that, highlight, and also what the City Councilman of New York has said is ensuring that there is, that the agencies that oversee the implementation of the elections in this system are adequately funded and adequately supported to ensure that there is that there is the infrastructure in place. So I just want to put out there that Common Cause works in a number of states across the country on supporting these systems and on implementation. So I would be happy to, if you would like to hear from other constituents, and I'm sure other my colleagues here at Campaign Legal Center and Every Voice, I think we'd all collectively be happy to weigh in and provide additional resources or answer any questions that other states may be experiencing or have experienced over the years. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for both. Okay, thank you. Thank you for hanging in there these many hours. With nobody else here to testify, the hearing on the long government hearing on bill numbers 170680, 170681, 170682, and resolution 170696 will be held to the call of the chair. Thank you.